Good morning, everyone. For the folks with the NC Chamber, for some reason, I'm not getting an audio stream at the moment, but it says that I'm on. So good morning and welcome to the NC Chamber's Environmental Compliance Conference, held virtually again, despite our great hopes and efforts. Nevertheless, we're looking forward to hosting you, and it's my pleasure to walk you through today's event. My name is Sean Sullivan with Robinson Bradshaw, and we're proud to be the presenting sponsor today. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our gold sponsor for today's event, Dell Technologies, our silver sponsors, Duke Energy, MVP Southgate, Shield Engineering, and Southern Power, and our bronze sponsors, Iroko, Baden Business Park, Geosyntec, North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives, and Centerra. Many thanks to our patron sponsors as well. Yeah, you can find a complete list of today's sponsors in the digital program. We're grateful to all of our sponsors for their support of this annual event. We'd like to keep the conversation active on social media, and for those of you who'd like to join in, please use the hashtag NCEnviro.
Welcome to today's event, hosted by the NC Chamber.
Good morning, and welcome to the NC Chamber's Environmental Compliance Conference, held virtually again, despite our greatest hopes and efforts. Nevertheless, we're looking forward to hosting you, and it's my pleasure to walk you through today's event. I'm Sean Sullivan with Robinson Bradshaw, and we're proud to be the presenting sponsor today. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our gold sponsor for today's event, Dell Technologies, our silver sponsors, Duke Energy, MVP Southgate, Shield Engineering, and Southern Power, bronze sponsors, Iroko, Baden Business Park, Geosyntec, North Carolina's Electric Cooperatives, and Centerra. Many thanks to our patron sponsors as well. You can find a complete list of today's sponsors in your digital program, and we are grateful to all of our sponsors for their support of this annual event. We'd like to keep the conversation active on social media today, and for those of you who'd like to join in, please use the hashtag NCEnviro. Lastly, be on the lookout for a recap email in a day or so, which will include a recording of today's program and any resources that are shared during the event. That email will also provide information on how to request CLE credits. As our state navigates the next phases of pandemic recovery, our job creators need regulatory certainty and support to strengthen North Carolina's economic growth and to make it to help it continue to be one of the best states in the country to work and live. To do so, we must strike a balance between protecting the state's environment and encouraging a thriving business climate for our state's current and future job creators. We hope that this conference can play a small part in doing so. Before we begin, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank the department for its continued support of this event, as well as each of our individual presenters for today's program. We couldn't do this without their effort and their commitment, and I hope you'll find each of the segments today to be informative. With that, let's get on with it. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Secretary Elizabeth Beiser for the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Governor Roy Cooper named Elizabeth S. Beiser as Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality in June 2021. She's the first woman confirmed as DEQ Secretary, overseeing the state agency whose mission is to protect North Carolina's environment and natural resources. Secretary Beiser's appointment marks a return to the department. She previously served as Director of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs. Most recently, before coming back to the department, she served as the President of Beiser Strategies, LLC, and the Senior Policy Advisor of the Recycling Partnership. Prior to that, she was Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs of the Recycling Partnership and a Government Relations and Policy Advisor at Brooks Pierce. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Public Administration from UNC Chapel Hill. Secretary Beiser, warmest welcome to our virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you virtually today. DEQ has a long-standing relationship with the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. We both play a vital role in helping the state prosper. And I believe that our partnership shows that economic progress and environmental protection go hand in hand. You know, it's no secret that North Carolina is one of the fastest growing states in the nation. We're seeing rapid population growth and record economic investment in our state. It's all great news. And one of the reasons people and companies are choosing to move here is because they know we have the economic and regulatory environment to support business growth in a responsible way. You're going to hear from a number of my colleagues at DEQ this morning on the important work that is happening across the department to support our growing state. I'm going to touch on a few areas that are top priorities for me. First, we saw record investment in water and wastewater infrastructure in this past year's budget, $1.68 billion, with more on the way from the federal bipartisan infrastructure bill. Aging water and sewer infrastructure, or the lack thereof in some communities, pose environmental and economic challenges, especially in rural North Carolina. This infrastructure is vital to bringing clean water and economic development to the areas that need it the most. This money will help fix aging systems and will help pay for upgrades, all the while keeping costs affordable for customers. You know, one thing I say frequently around the department is it's easy to spend money, but it's hard to spend money well. We're committed to spending these dollars in an impactful way across our state. Another area of investment that's really key for the department is flood resilience. We all know the devastating impact major storms have had in our state. And as we rebuild from those storms, it's important that we're doing so in a way that leads us to be more resilient, more prepared for the next storm. Because it's not a matter of if we get another major storm, but when. We're working on the flood resiliency blueprint. There's an RFI that's out right now, and we're moving quickly on plans to develop a blueprint so it can be used as a tool for future investment and to make our state more resilient. On the operational side, I'm focused on modernization, making it easier to do business with DEQ. That means making our processes more transparent and accessible, while also streamlining the permitting process and reducing backlogs. With our permit transformation project, our goal is to have every stage of the permit application available online. I'm sure that many of you have heard my predecessor say, if you can track a pizza, you should be able to track a permit. We're working to make that a reality, and we really appreciate the chamber support in getting the first 2 years of this 5-year project funded. While I'm sure a lot of you are accustomed to working with DEQ on permitting, I do want to point out our non-regulatory programs as well. Jamie Reagan will be speaking later about our environmental stewardship initiative. It's a free and voluntary program for companies that want to go beyond the minimum environmental regulations. We provide no-cost technical assistance to ESI members, including strategies to reduce energy and water usage. In 2020 alone, ESI members reported total cost savings of more than $7 million from actions like reducing water and waste and energy use. You know, it's good for the bottom line and it's good for the environment. And this year marks the 20th anniversary of that program. I've challenged Jamie to get 20 new members for our 20th year, so I'm sure she would be grateful if you would help her meet that goal. Speaking of energy, this is another area of collaboration for our organizations. In order to achieve our state's climate and energy goals, it's going to take action from all of us. Between the actions of House Bill 951, EO 80, and the recently signed EO 246, which Governor Cooper signed earlier this month, we have ambitious goals for statewide greenhouse gas emission reductions. EO 246 also solidifies the governor's commitment to public engagement and environmental justice by requiring cabinet agencies to develop a public participation plan and appoint an environmental justice lead, something that I'm proud to say DEQ has led the way on. I can tell you that at DEQ, public engagement and input from community stakeholders have made us a better agency. Stakeholder engagement helps us respond more effectively to the people that we serve. It's clear to us that proactive community engagement on the front end leads to better outcomes and fewer issues down the road. We are committed to continuing to work with you on this front. You know, sometimes a permit issued by DEQ becomes a point of contention between a company and a community simply because it's the only time residents have the ability to weigh in on a project that may impact them. At a basic level, it's about being good neighbors and engaging with people beyond your fence line, a concept that I know a lot of you are committed to. I know Sharon Martin will be talking more with you about this topic later this morning. The common theme throughout this entire morning is that the protection of our natural resources, North Carolina's natural resources, ensuring healthy land, air, and water supports a healthy economy. I am looking forward to continuing that work with you to ensure that North Carolina continues to be the best place to live, work, and do business. So Sean, thanks again for the chance to be here today.
Thank you, Secretary Beiser. With that, I think we are ready to move on to our next portion of the agenda, which will be a conversation with NCDEQ's Assistant Secretary Sushma Mazemore and my colleague Emily Sherlock, who is also a partner here at Robinson Bradshaw. Thanks to the both of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks, Sean. I'm going to apologize in advance. You're going to hear from me twice today, and I'm very croaky. So I'm glad that we have a virtual platform, although I was very disappointed when we first moved to this. But please bear with my croaky voice today, everybody. I apologize. Sushma, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. You and I are going to talk through a number of the initiatives and strategies that Secretary Beiser just mentioned, but in a little bit more depth, and then we'll go into a little bit more granularity later on with our various departments as we go through air, water, and waste later today. But one of the topics that Secretary Beiser mentioned early in her address was economic development in North Carolina. I know I have had clients and prospective clients who reach out about this and say, you know, North Carolina is really attractive. We're looking at coming here. Can you help me sort of navigate what the environmental permitting process and all of those types of things tie in with the economic development are? So I wanted to hit that topic first. Major economic development projects often have multiple permits that span multiple agencies and multiple divisions at DEQ. So could you talk to us a little bit about the role DEQ plays in coordinating with other agencies and vetting potential projects that may be coming to our state?
Sure, Emily. Good morning, everyone. Well, we recognize that North Carolina is a great place to live and work. I am myself a product of relocation back in the 90s when the Research Triangle Park was just picking up. So I can understand the reasons why businesses and folks would want to live here. Generally, in relating to the work at DEQ, generally the more information that can be shared up front in the beginning with the department, the better, specifically with the divisions themselves first. And if there's coordination required, then with a division and department heads. Early communication with the department can give companies a better sense of what to expect from us with regards to permits and other requirements, specifically the type of permits and the time it takes to process and review them. If they know ahead of time what the expectations are and what we know that would be anticipated from there, then everyone is happier and we can reach better outcomes. Right now, we recognize there is a need for coordination and common messaging within state government. So we are working with EDPNC and the Department of Commerce. We've offered trainings and we're continuing to discuss other ways to ensure that all of our folks are familiar with DEQ's requirements, but also at various stages of conversations on expansions and new projects being discussed at the state level. Staff are also getting trained in terms of what the upfront processes are and what the latter processes are. More recently, in some of these large projects where there have been multiple permit divisions involved, we have formed an internal group and an external group with the companies that we meet regularly. We look at our schedules, we look at where things are, we resolve any issues with the plans that have been submitted. And we think that that model is working well, but we'll continue to tweak them. And one last thing I'll add is, in some cases, companies are coming and considering North Carolina for other reasons. One example is an existing company was interested in sustainability, and they wanted some credits for energy conservation. And so we were able to work with them and utilities and Department of Commerce to help achieve their goals. So that's how it's working so far.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit more about the specific sort of process within DEQ when you've got a need for permits from a lot of different divisions within your organization?
So, of course, the division directors will give you a really good idea of their own processes. In the more recent project that we've been working with, I worked with a few high-level folks to first get a big picture of what their needs are, specifically what permits they think that they may need across state government. We've developed a schedule, a timeline, but also which activities would require the most time, the most attention, and are considered, complex permits. And from them, we have been working with the divisions, their staff, division directors on a regular basis to walk through those processes.
Perfect. I know planning in advance and having an idea of the schedule is very important to our clients, for the attorneys in the room. So I appreciate that DEQ is participating in that and helping facilitate it. That's fantastic. Let's hit on another topic that has sort of made our list of hot topics for now the past several years that I've been participating in this event for sure. And that's emerging contaminants and strategy. And specifically, a few months ago, EPA Administrator Regan, who was, of course, formerly DEQ Secretary, came to Raleigh, made a big announcement on PFAS, and unveiled a roadmap for how EPA was going to tackle the issue. What does DEQ's PFAS strategy look like, and how are you coordinating those efforts with EPA?
Yeah, Emily, that's a really good question and a really big question. So I will try to break it up into a variety of segments. First of all, DEQ's PFAS strategy has been in place for many, many years. Our divisions have been working with a lot of experts in the field, including EPA, but the scientific community and the communities in North Carolina, companies, to address PFAS contamination that originally surfaced at the Chemours plant. And so through the implementation of the consent order, North Carolina has developed a fairly large leadership role in answering these tough questions. Part of these have been first time ever asking questions and solving the problem. It's been a learning process. The roadmap itself illustrates some of the lessons learned and some of the pathways that North Carolina and a couple other states that have been pioneers in this area have evolved and has formed the federal roadmap process. When former Secretary Regan and now Administrator Regan came to North Carolina, he acknowledged that this is where many of the concepts originated. Moving forward, we continue to work with EPA. In fact, we're having a very large meeting with EPA, with Region 4 and various of their headquarters and ORD staff to address a few items that we call an ongoing additional information needs and data gaps. We are also preparing for a large scale response on the execution of the roadmap that EPA will be doing, but we are also working on a variety of initiatives on ourselves. One example is when the roadmap came out, EPA released a toxicity assessment for GenX. As a result of that toxicity assessment, we examined what the impact of that could be on the levels at which we are currently enforcing the consent order. But it also allowed us to better understand what the impacts of additional toxicity assessment and advisories that are coming out from EPA scientific work and their SAB work would mean for states like North Carolina. We have examined all of our data to determine what PFAS compounds are prevalent, where are they found, how do these scientific assessments and advisories inform what we do next. And going back to a few items that I mentioned, we're looking at those data gaps and information needs and working with the scientific community to fill them. We're talking with a couple of universities now. We will be working with our own business partners to Secretary Beiser, she mentions collaborative efforts is what we would like to proceed with. And so collaborating with the businesses to better understand what are the options, what are the levels and discharges and emissions at which these compounds are being released. And if not they're released, then what is considered safe level. Those are all challenging questions for the future. And I'm looking forward to working with all stakeholders in achieving our goals.
Anticipate this is going to remain a hot topic for at least the foreseeable future each time we do this conference. And I expect we'll also hear some additional details about how this overarching strategy with respect to emerging contaminants is going to affect each of the divisions when we hear from those folks later today. So moving on to the next topic and another one that Secretary Beiser talked about, that's infrastructure and resilience. Secretary Beiser mentioned earlier that there were significant investments being made in resilience and the importance of that money being spent well. Can you talk a little bit more about what resilience funding is available and what the department's role is with that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the first tranche of infrastructure funding is coming out of the ARPA funds and what we call the American Rescue Plan. And then the second tranche at a large scale will be coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Currently, through our Division of Water Infrastructure, there have been a series of announcements that have been made, public releases on the solicitation process for water and wastewater systems. In the 2021-22 legislation, I guess I should say 2021 legislation, it contains a lot of earmarked projects for rural communities and other communities that are distressed utilities. We can go through a lot in terms of the details of where those investments will be made, but it also creates the federal funds that are coming from the ARPA funds to create a program through a series of 2 to 4 solicitations throughout the year for the next few years to distribute these funds. We've established criteria for prioritizing where these funds go, and all of that is available. We'd be happy to come back and provide a more detailed presentation or even an overview or a fact sheet for folks that are interested. One thing that I wanted to mention is, as Secretary Beiser mentioned, that we want to use this money wisely. SWIA is the entity that we have to go through for approvals for the non-earmarked projects. So the proposals and the plans that we're proposing to them really considers where what we call donut holes are currently, and where not only distressed communities, but on the verge of distress can be supported through these programs. And then finally, through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, actually famously called the bill is the acronym for it. They are getting ready, the federal government, in terms of developing guidance and rules for the various agencies that will be receiving those funds. So for example, DOT and Commerce and Emergency Management, all of those groups, as well as DEQ under our existing programs, are expected to receive federal funds under those guidance to distribute on infrastructure such as the power grid, for homes, for roads and bridges, for electrification, for infrastructure related to EV charging stations. And and just building resilience, not only for the electric power grid distribution sector, but also water systems and other built infrastructure. So there's a lot going on. We're happy to communicate on where things are. Just to let us know. And our websites are pretty up to date. And our comms folks are really good at getting that information out.
Perfect. Thank you for that update. To the next topic on our sort of list of hot topics, we also heard Secretary Beiser mention, and that's the 2021 energy bill and then the new executive orders from Governor Cooper. And specifically, she mentioned two of them that you and I were going to go in a little bit more in depth on. The new executive order signed by the governor is very comprehensive, and I know that we're going to hear some more specifics from our other presenters today. But if you could kind of give us a primer on that, an idea of what's contained in the legislation is going to help us achieve the goals of Executive Orders 80 and 246 that Secretary Beiser mentioned.
Sure, Emily. I'll start out with, like you said, it is a very comprehensive bill and a very complex and detailed bill. There are a lot of pieces to it. I'll go into three major ones. The first one, obviously, that is of interest related to the executive orders is the target set for carbon emissions. Basically, the legislation requires the North Carolina Utilities Commission to take all reasonable steps to reduce CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, by a level of 70% by 2030 from the baseline of 2005, and work to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. It also allows Duke Energy to own 55% of the solar and solar paired with battery storage as its ownership. And so that is split between Duke Energy and the private sector. The NCUC also has the discretion to delay compliance if they seem or deem warranted in the event new nuclear or wind projects are needed or can achieve the goals. The timeline requires Duke Energy to submit this carbon plan, excuse me, by May of this year. And then it will go through a public review process where interveners will comment and testify related to the adequacy of that plan. And ultimately, the commission will make a final ruling in December, and it will be the commission's carbon plan that will become the roadmap for the carbon reductions. So that's really where most of the greenhouse gas related goals of the EO are coming from. Secondly, in the executive order, we discussed a lot related to transitioning to a 21st century power system and modernizing our energy system such that we can accommodate technologies of the future and create a robust economy for North Carolina. And through the stakeholder process, a concept called performance-based regulation was developed, and some of you were involved in that. So the legislation does include performance-based regulation concepts. One of them is called a multi-year rate plans. This allows Duke Energy to come in at a more spread out ways of filing their rates. So instead of coming every 1 to 2 years to file their rate requests, they bundle it up and as needed, and these are how multi-year rate plans are brought in front of the Utilities Commission. It spreads out their costs, but there also brings in some uncertainty. And so there is some questions as to how well that would be executed. States that have put these mechanisms in have really had a good oversight and ensure that the costs are maintained. And this is something that I think the public as well as the business community will need to watch very carefully. And it also includes a competitive procurement of renewable energy that has been passed on from the previous legislation. One other thing I wanted to note that the legislation has is a concept of performance incentive metrics. So basically, the utilities earn their revenue based on the goals or outcomes that they achieve that the public the ratepayers as well as the Utilities Commission set forward. So many of these targets that are made, as long as those targets are achieved at three basic tenets of our power system: affordability, reliability, and safety. If all of those are met, then the utilities would be allowed certain types of incentives to be earned. And then one last thing I wanted to say, Emily, because this doesn't get discussed, is that the bill contains a concept called securitization. Currently, there are a variety of coal-fired power plants that are, the company has now shown that it can be operated with less cost. Some of those costs can be passed on by shutting down those coal units, and securitization passes the cost of those retirements both to the utilities as well as customers. So at the end of the day, we save money as ratepayers, but also the company saves money. And instead of all the burden be taken by the ratepayers for the retirement of all the coal fleet, those costs are spread between the company and the ratepayers. And that's also in the legislation.
Thank you. So one quick comment, because I'm seeing some questions pop up in the Q&A. We're definitely going to have some time at the end to hit questions. So we'll circle back to what's there. If others have questions as we're going along, use your Q&A box and we will come back to those at the end to make sure we answer anything that we can. With that, we have one other topic to hit on our list of hot topics today, Sushma, and this is definitely an important one. This is for the process improvement for environmental permitting. And the secretary mentioned this as well. And I do distinctly remember former Secretary Regan saying, if you can track a pizza, you should track a permit, here at this very compliance conference a couple of years ago. So if we can kind of talk about that topic and see how things are going, we know that permitting is one of the biggest functions of DEQ. And Secretary Beiser mentioned that the department's working very hard to modernize these systems. Can you tell us some more details about how that's progressing and some things that you guys are working on?
Yeah, Emily, this is a department-wide initiative where it touches almost every facet of our work. The goal here is to streamline first and understand what our current processes are, what we call the current state, and how we can improve the way we intake and process our permits to how we issue those permits. Our division directors are here. They can specifically talk about how they are going through their reviews. But this front end work really is an analysis of, is it efficient? Do we have areas where certain application and or review process is creating redundancies and or confusion and or delaying the time from the customer's end, but also from the permit engineer's end? We just completed a process with our Division of Coastal Management, and as they reviewed their paper tracking system, there was one question that required almost 90% of their permit applications to be returned. And then they basically, after looking at it, evaluated that there's a better way to form that question. There's better ways to provide guidance on how to answer that question. And so these are the kind of things that are being done at the technical level and at the processing level. Then the next phase is system automation and putting all of that into a system. So the enterprise system that DIT is leading is supposed to provide the customer a one-point common entry system into DEQ's portal, which will allow them to access their applications, understand the status of their permits, understand who's working on them and where they are in that pizza tracking system. That is the vision. There's a lot of work that has to go into that. But as Sharon will mention later on, the system will also serve the public as an information tool. We get many requests on where are these facilities? What kind of permit is it going to be? What does what does the details look like? It gives the public an access point to understand what's happening in their neighborhood, and to be able to participate as needed in that public comment process or any additional stakeholder work that's going on. And Jamie, Regan and others are going to definitely talk about that. So I won't get into any of the details where things are.
Understand. So one other piece of the permitting, we know that the General Assembly has required DEQ to study the possibility of expanding the express permitting option. Can you give us an idea about how that study is going and some predictions for the future on express permitting?
Yes, Emily, that's a really good question. We are working very diligently to examine at all of our divisions where express permitting could be a route based on where we have applied it before, where it has worked and not worked, but also where we think it could be applied to new programs. Right now, we are in the process of drafting a report. We have some initial concepts prepared, some pilot ideas that we're considering through a regional office. So I would recommend that the report is due in March. So we are preparing the draft now. If there are any specific ideas from the attendees here that they would like to for us to consider or look at, to contact me or Joy Hicks, who's our legislative director, who's leading that work. And Joy is working with each of our division directors to identify those opportunities, to also relate where we do not think it's conducive to doing that and the reasons for that. So it is a great opportunity that the General Assembly has provided a department to look at that flexible option.
Okay, thank you. At this point, let me jump down here to our Q&A box and see what we have and cover that. So someone in the audience asked, on some of the pages on the North Carolina DEQ website, various engineering and environmental consulting firms that the regulated community can turn to for support, the North Carolina IHB REC program, for instance, are listed. However, listings of the regulated community, including existing permits, NORRs, NOVs, and NFAs, is lacking. Are there any plans on making information on the regulated community more transparent and readily available? I know on the permitting side, you just sort of mentioned that, but what about in other areas like the NFAs, NOVs?
I will try to answer that question, which is that's something we can look into. If you have specific ideas or thoughts on what is needed, please relay that to us. Our website and our information portals are designed to meet the customer's needs. If the data are available, if it can be compiled in an automated way, we certainly look into it. We also have to ensure that whatever we post is not confidential information, and that it can be and it's vetted through our divisions. Those are the things we would have to check for.
So a related question on that, and sort of where folks can go to find information and some thoughts on what DEQ might be doing on that in the future. I know that some state agencies have sort of comprehensive collections of guidance documents that are organized by program area. Virginia's regulatory town hall is an example of that. Is that something that DEQ might consider doing to help folks easily put their hands on guidance documents relating to particular areas?
That's really interesting. It would be nice to know whether the guidance documents are related to specific types of activities within a permitting process, or we have lots of guidance documents on some basics around computations for analysis in order to demonstrate something, to guidance documents around the basics around the framework for how a permit, certain types of permits may be processed and what our schedule and instructions are. So it'd be helpful to know specifics on what the ask is related to those guidance documents to better understand that. Like, for example, right now on our website, we have an entry through our rules. And, you know, from the outside, you don't need to go into individual divisions to go to what rules apply. You can go through that main site, and there is another site where all the permits are located. Those common entry points are where a department's consolidated work is shown, rather than individual. You have to go through individual divisions to find what you need. So we, you know, give us the ideas and we'll certainly look into them.
Perfect. I mean, I know, I will say, I think North Carolina is more user friendly on their website than some other states that I've had to reach out to find stuff. So I think we're a little bit ahead on some of those issues. But I know that's a topic for a lot of folks, of just the transparency and where do I look. And so it's good to hear from you, Sushma, that the department is kind of all ears on that when there's suggestions. And, you know, I'd mentioned that just to our regulated community, our lawyers, our consultants who are all listening today, you know, for coming up with ideas of how it's easiest to organize information. I do not see any other questions, so I will give it a minute here. If anybody else in the audience has any questions for Sushma before we sign off and head to the next topic, now is the time to post the Q&A box and we can touch on those. All right, I don't see anything else popping up. I know we're heading a little bit ahead of schedule, but we still got our 30 minutes in. So I will turn it over to you, Sean. And Sushma, thank you again so much for taking the time to chat with us about some of these initiatives and, you know, what we're calling the hot topics for DEQ this year.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you, Sushma. Thank you, Emily, for that. We'll move on to now our first division update, which is the state of the air. We'll be hearing from Mike Abrazinskis, who is the Director of the Division of Air Quality, and Mac McGuffey, who is a partner at Troutman Pepper, who'll be serving as our moderator. And I'm sure there is enough to talk about that we will be right back on schedule by the time we're done with this program. Mac and Mike, please take it away, and thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you, Sean, and welcome to everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce to you all the Director of the Division of Air Quality at North Carolina DEQ, Michael Abrazinskis. Mike has been the head of DEQ for almost 5 years now, but as most of you probably already know, he's been a part of DEQ for a lot longer than that. Before he took on the role of director, he was also deputy director. Before he was deputy director, he was the planning section chief. Before that, he was an environmental engineer supervisor. And before that, he was an environmental engineer. And even before that, he was a meteorologist with the division. And so basically, to find a DAQ without Mike in it, you have to go back to 1999. He's been here serving the state of North Carolina basically since the turn of the millennium. So there are many reasons to be thankful to have someone with such experience in these very important and often very thorny topics when it comes to air quality. Not only that, he works outside the state as well. He helps navigate difficult regional air quality issues in his role as chairman of SESARM, the Southeastern Air Resource Managers. He's also vice chair of a similar Mid-Atlantic organization, and he's a board member of CAPCA. So he's basically an air expert's air expert and a terrific resource to have here in North Carolina. As Emily and Sushma were talking through, they were asking for questions. We'd like to do the same. This is always more fun when we hear from the audience what is most concerning to you, so that we can see if we can answer some of those questions. And to get us started, we certainly have some hot topics. There's plenty to talk about with respect to air quality. The first question, Mike, that I always have to ask you is how are we doing? How is the air quality in North Carolina?
First off, thanks, Mac, for the kind introduction, and thanks to the Chamber for the opportunity today. And we're doing great, Mac, in North Carolina. You know, we've been attaining all federal public health air quality standards for 2,348 consecutive days and counting. So that's great news for public health and the economy in North Carolina.
That is great news. Now, we have heard talk of EPA revisiting some of those standards and taking another hard look at ozone and fine particulate in particular, with maybe fine particulate being the standard that might present the greatest concern. Do you see any concerns arising out of those evaluations at the federal level that might change the picture here in North Carolina?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I'll start with the fine particulate review first, because that's, I think, one to really watch in the near term. And you've probably seen that the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, or CASAC, is taking up the integrated science assessment and the policy assessment in some of their scheduled meetings over the next 2 months. So that's moving pretty swiftly. And so in discussions with folks on or close to the CASAC, I'm thinking there's very little support for maintaining the current 12 microgram per cubic meter annual PM 2.5 standard. So yes, we are looking at the what ifs. You know, what if the annual standard is lowered to, say, 10, from 12 down to 10? You know, and looking at our data currently, you know, our highest design value in North Carolina for the annual PM 2.5 standard is 9 right now. So even if EPA lowered the annual standard today by 25%, we would attain.
Well, that's absolutely terrific news. Do you see any trends in air quality in North Carolina that might suggest any issues in the future, or are we actually trending in a direction that is favorable for maintaining this great status of good air quality in the state?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that the trends are really good, and we're actually in the process of updating our trends report for our website. So look out for that new information in the coming months. But spoiler alert, you know, that we're looking great for you know, all the pollutants, you know, and compliance with these public health standards and the national ambient air quality standards is absolutely our highest priority. So, you know, 2 hands remaining on the steering wheel to make sure that we're maintaining this status, to ensure that we're well positioned, or as well positioned as possible, if the standard should change in the future. You know, in terms of ozone, you know, I think I spoke previously to this group about, at the end of the 2019 ozone season, we were walking a fine line in Charlotte, and then the pandemic hit, and on-road mobile emissions declined greatly in 2020 for that ozone season. And then 2021 was also a quiet ozone season in the Charlotte area. So now, you know, with the 3-year average and the design value, we're in pretty good shape there. But it remains an area that I think we really need to continue to watch in North Carolina, as it appears that the current emission levels under just the right meteorological conditions can still produce a fair amount of ozone in Charlotte. So we're going to keep our eye on that.
Yeah, that's great to hear. We certainly hope we can come out of this pandemic at some point, but that may mean additional activities that would add pressure there. So good to know, of course, that as we expect, that the division is keeping close watch on all of that. With respect to the possibility of new standards, tell me how that could still have an impact in the state, even if we don't see those standards resulting in new non-attainment areas. And in particular, I'd be concerned about the potential impact on permitting, because of course those standards are relevant for obtaining the air permits that sources need. What can you tell me about how that picture might change if we see new standards coming out of Washington?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think as I see it right now, that's the biggest potential impact area of a lower PM 2.5 standard, for example. I think that lower standard certainly has the potential to greatly impact permitting when modeling is involved. But, you know, to say anything more than that at this point, you know, would be speculation. But I think generally with the current standards, PM 2.5 modeling for a large project is already a challenge. We recognize that. We don't always see all of those challenges because when we get a permit application, those issues have been worked through by the applicant and their consultant perhaps. But so I think that's just an area that we're all going to have to watch and pay close attention to moving forward.
Certainly, and particularly with ozone and particulate matter being pollutants that by and large form in the atmosphere from emissions. It's a very difficult modeling challenge. What has the division done to understand and work through the issues associated with modeling secondary formation of those pollutants, given how important that could be with new lower standards from EPA?
Yeah, thankfully thus far, in following the EPA guidance on the secondary formation of pollutants in the permitting process, we haven't, there aren't a lot of projects that have triggered that analysis thus far, but far more could with lower standards. So that's another great example of, even if we're in attainment off the bat with any new lower standard for PM 2.5 or ozone, there are these challenges from a modeling perspective for both new greenfield facilities and expansions of major sources that include significant emissions increases. I think that's where the true challenges will lie.
With respect to permitting, on that topic, we heard a fair amount from Emily and Sushma about how the division is working very hard to streamline that process, make it as easy as tracking a pizza. If it only were that easy to order, right? But what can you tell us about those efforts, specifically with respect to the Division of Air Quality and how you all are trying to make those same kind of changes?
Yeah, great question. And actually, when I have a chance here, I'll put in the chat a link to a tool that we already have on our website at the Division of Air Quality that maybe helps answer one of the questions that Sushma got at the end of her session about permitting and compliance data being online. We have all of that online for the Division of Air Quality. It's all mapped on a GIS map of North Carolina with all the facilities, a little dot on the map. You click on the dot on the map and it brings up a little window where you can then click on the current permit and other documents, compliance documents even related to that facility, and then even EPA's ECHO site to see if there's information on that website about that facility as well. So we have some tools already online that are good and of use that can help with that regard relative to that earlier question. But back to what our plans are, and I've just got to reflect back to March of 2020, when everyone's plans to digitize things certainly changed. and this year, I will say, as part of our division's digital documents initiative, we're going to be seeking changes to our rules to eliminate as much of the paper submittals as we possibly can that are currently required via rule. But before we can do that, we have to have all of the internal information systems ready to go. We have to have all of the standard operating procedures in place for use of those systems for both us internally and for external users. And none of that is free and none of that is cheap. And so, building those types of systems and converting to those types of systems. But hey, it's the year 2022 and we must advance. So stay tuned for further updates from our division on that front as we introduce rule concepts later this year, like I said, to eliminate the requirement for paper submittals to the division. In terms of tracking permits, we every night at midnight, we have an automated report that pulls from our existing information system that updates the status of all applications that we have in-house. So there's lots of metadata there in that report. So folks can track that. It's not flashy by any means at this point, but there's data there that folks can review. And then I think, our permitting, I think there's recognition across this entire departmental project of transforming our permitting process that some of DAQ's permitting processes are amongst some of the most complex. And maybe there aren't any two Title V permits that are exactly alike. So building an information system may take a little longer for our division, but again, we're working together as a team and we're certainly in the queue to advance those systems for our division.
Well, that's definitely great news. There are fewer and fewer places in the world where you need a wet signature, and it can be very frustrating to try and accomplish that, particularly in this pandemic. But I would agree with Emily. Taking a look at how North Carolina's Division of Air Quality stacks up against other states, I think you guys are doing a fantastic job of making sure that we have the kind of transparency that Michael Regan had talked about when he was there at the department, and what of course we all should want, and trying to be able to make sure we understand what's going on at the division, and particularly of course for sources looking to try and get that very important approval to start their projects. What can you tell me about other challenges that have come out of the pandemic? Of course, the pandemic has affected our lives in so many ways, forcing us into a digital world, as today is of course proof of as well, is just one aspect of how we've had to deal with this pandemic. I'm sure it's been affecting the division in other ways. What more can you tell us about the challenges you're facing and what you're doing to meet them?
Sure. So a couple things I can touch on here. First, just to share with you some of our permitting metrics, really in context of over the last 5 years, but highlight what's happened during the pandemic. So we had our peak of Title V permits issued in 2020 during the height of the pandemic, when most of our team was teleworking. So that's one key metric that over the last 5 years. And then we also had our peak of Title V permit applications received just last year in 2021 during the pandemic. So we're busy, we're productive, and we've been busy and productive through the pandemic from a permitting perspective. And I'm really proud of our team on that front for all of their work. But some of the two greatest issues that I think about or work on just about every day right now really are focused on, one, optimizing the balance between workload and revenues, and two, really effectively managing the silver tsunami across the division. And neither of these are closely tied to the pandemic, but kind of sort of might be a little bit, and I'll touch on that. So on that first one, optimizing the balance between workload and revenues, we recently stabilized that in our Title V program with the recent fee changes that went into effect. But the remainder of our program, we don't exactly have that optimal balance right now. And one example is in our synthetic minor permitting program, where we charge $400 is the permit application fee for a synthetic minor facility in North Carolina. The annual fee for those facilities is $1,500 or even less with the compliance discount that is in place. And we haven't changed either one of those fees since they went into effect in 1994. We currently have 620 of those synthetic minor facilities in North Carolina, and many of them are just as complex as Title V facilities, because of course a synthetic minor facility is kind of a Title V facility. They've just taken a limit to limit their potential to emit below Title V thresholds to avoid the Title V permitting program and fees and procedures. So those permit fees, needless to say, don't cover the costs of the synthetic minor permitting program. But other revenues that are broadly designated for administration of the air quality program are used to supplement the synthetic minor fees to cover the cost of that program. The problem there is those other revenues have been and are projected to continue declining while the overall workload and expenses are not. So we've initiated a process here during the pandemic where we're evaluating workload. We're recognizing staffing and capacity issues, including the silver tsunami. We're recognizing we're in a hyper competitive market, especially here in Raleigh, for air quality professionals with EPA's offices and their many contractors nearby. And we have increasing costs. And a quick example of that is, just simple legislative increases authorized by the General Assembly. State employees got a 2.5% raise last year. We're receipts and grant funded. We didn't get any money to fund those increases. So that's an example of a $400,000 increase in salary liability over the course of a year that I have to find from somewhere. So we're working on those issues. And so that's a big issue, but that staffing and capacity issue has certainly been accentuated during the pandemic. A lot of people and some people, and this is true in public sector, private sector, we've heard about the Great Resignation. We've heard about people just rethinking their career choices. That layered on with the silver tsunami in our division, that kind of adds up and it compounds very, very quickly.
Can you give us any metrics of that silver tsunami that will give folks a sense of really a little bit more detail on the challenge you're facing there?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. I've joked that a really good thing about our division right now is our top 13 managers and our leaders within the Division of Air Quality have over 385 years of air quality experience.
Wow.
That's amazing. That's a good thing. It's also a bad thing because that means all of them are going to be eligible to retire really soon. So that's a metric that makes my eye twitch. The other thing I'm looking at is in our permitting section, where that section stands to have 50% or close to 50% of the section retire in less than 5 years. And many of those folks are the ones working on complex applications, and they're doing it very efficiently. And so that group also has 214 applications in-house right now to work on. So that's merely one program area and a quick snapshot where we need to build capacity and develop a bench, especially in those complex source sectors such as utilities and landfills and paper mills and chemical facilities and military bases, where we're 0 deep or 1 deep right now in terms of staffing. And with those projections of people becoming eligible to retire and talking with them and understanding their plans, this is an urgent issue. And this is my greatest management challenge right now is finding a way to bring some folks in ahead of those retirements to get them experience, because people just don't have air quality permitting experience off the street for a landfill, as an example. So that's a skill set, and we have to make an investment in those new employees, train them up, and get them some experience perhaps before these experienced folks retire. So we're working through that. That's one of my greatest challenges in 2022.
Yeah, sounds like no easy answer to that one. Trying to get good help these days, as they say, can be very difficult. So best of luck with those challenges. Before we leave permitting, one more question. And I know we don't have time to cover it as it would be due, but environmental justice is, of course, a very hot topic these days. The EPA is talking a lot about it. Of course, we've had a significant effort all around in many individual states, including North Carolina, to try and work on this topic. We could spend the whole hour on it, honestly. But what can you tell me, just from a high level, how does environmental justice issues play into air permitting in a way that allows the division to address that issue in a meaningful way in air permitting?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, this is very much a part of our program. EJ is very much a part of our program. It's an important topic. I think our division has led the way in doing enhanced outreach to communities as part of the permitting process over the last couple of years. I think we could talk about this all day, but I think I'll leave it at this. And it's kind of a request of the regulated community, especially for any greenfield or new Title V facility or any major source making a major modification that results in a significant increase in emissions. Please make an effort to be cognizant of the community and the surroundings, and to the extent possible, have a public engagement process prior to submitting that application to the division. And simple experience and gaining more experience every day on this is telling us that if our public process for a draft air quality permit for the project becomes the primary way that a community finds out about a facilities project, then that permitting process has a much greater potential to take longer due to the division needing to address a wide variety of comments or questions raised about the project. So we're emphasizing that, keeping your community that you're a part of informed and educated is really becoming a more critical part of the permitting process.
Very helpful and good advice on making sure to engage early and often and not just in the formal permitting process. I think that's an excellent way to make sure that those issues are fully addressed as they should be in air permitting. Moving on to a new topic, let's talk about regional haze. Regional haze, of course, a little bit of a bizarre program in the Clean Air Act, not like most programs focused on health. It's focused on visibility in national parks and wilderness areas. And it's also a little strange in that the state has to, once every 10 years, come up with a new plan for how to keep marching toward a day when we can say that in our national parks and wilderness areas, we have natural visibility conditions. Certainly, many states were unable to meet the deadline for the next round of regional haze plans, which was July of last year. And so a lot of states are scrambling to assemble those plans, get them to EPA. They have to go through that approval process. And EPA will have a chance to decide whether they agree with how the state plans to address visibility issues in those important areas of our nation. So what can you tell me about what North Carolina has been doing to make sure that their regional haze plan is well assembled and ready to go?
Yeah, sure. So we've been working on the technical analysis and developing the SIP for over 2 years for the second planning period for this public welfare standard. And so you're right, the second round of SIPs were due last July. EPA issued some guidance just before the due date that left states that had been working on this for almost 2 years at that point, just kind of making sure and level setting with all aspects of what we had worked on. But we did put our draft SIP out for public comment for the second planning period last fall. We received quite a number of comments, and we've been working on addressing those comments and working closely with EPA on making sure that as we prepare to submit this SIP, and we're getting close, we're a month or 2 or 3 away probably from submitting that officially to EPA, but we're making sure that we don't have any approvability issues when we do submit it. There were certainly some, we received some critical comments on the approach, but I think we need to take a look at what the data and the science is telling us from the analysis. And so both the observational data and the modeled projections that's of high quality from all of our staff shows that the observational data and the projections both show that we are well ahead of schedule with regard to the requirements of this public welfare program. In fact, our projections for the out year, the projection year, which is 2028, shows that we're actually projecting that we're going to be achieving what we need to achieve out in about 2048 or 2054. So 20 to 25 years ahead of schedule. So kind of gets back to where we started today about the great news. It's not just isolated to the public health standards, but it also carries over to the secondary and public welfare standards. So we're excited about the SIP that we're constructing and on the verge of submitting to EPA. We think it really, the work that we've done in the Southeast regionally and here in North Carolina, it should be setting the bar nationally for regional haze SIPs.
Well, that is definitely great news. During the first round of regional haze, the eastern states didn't have quite as much to do because they were also covered by the cross-state air pollution rule, and by and large, EPA had allowed compliance with that program to satisfy a lot of what the regional haze program would require. Out west, though, there were quite a number of disagreements and quite a number of disapprovals, most of them partial disapprovals and partial approvals by EPA of the state's plans. So what can you tell me, based on the feedback you've seen from EPA so far, do you expect to see a full approval, or do you expect there might still be some areas of disagreement that would have to be an issue to work through with EPA?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think our issues are very different than the issues out west, where there were some partial approvals. I feel like we are very well positioned to get a full approval, and that's our goal of working with EPA prior to submitting anything, is to work through any approvability issue. I want to know now if there's one line in the thousands of pages of things that we're going to submit, if there's one sentence that's a problem, I want to know it now and address it to the best of our abilities. So long as there are no late hits from EPA, I think we're very well positioned here in North Carolina.
That's great news. And yes, these plans are massive, thousands of pages, and a lot of work goes into that. So it's to the credit of the division to be able to assemble that and get it together in a way that hopefully is a constructive move forward for everyone involved. So looking forward to seeing that. Let's move on to another topic, one already hit also by Emily and Sushma, which is perfluoroalkyl substances. I feel like I always have to say that at least once so that I don't forget what PFAS stands for. But, from what Sushma said before, certainly there is significant effort that really began in North Carolina. And now pieces of that have become part of EPA's national roadmap on this issue. And that roadmap does contain components that specifically focus on air quality and what the EPA Office of Air and Radiation is going to do to deal with those questions. How can you tell me what the division's plans are for continuing to move forward on this issue, address this emerging contaminant, and also work within what EPA is setting out as their roadmap?
Sure. And I think I'll start by just sharing some of what we're doing first, and that is, given the experiences of the last several years here in North Carolina, we are certainly sharing our knowledge and in the realm of air emissions of PFAS, and that the fact that a modest amount of air emissions of PFAS can lead to negatively impacting nearby surface water and groundwater. And so that's an eye-opening concept for other air officials maybe across the country that hear about PFAS issues in a river in their state, and they say, oh, that's our Division of Water Resources issue. They hear our story and they go, whoa, really? So that's something that we continue to share with our colleagues nationally. But yes, regarding the PFAS strategic roadmap issued by EPA, and as I read that document when it came out, I couldn't help but reflect on the work that our team has done in this space since 2017 and how that contributed to this significant EPA action. In fact, I'm not sure that the EPA administrator would have been standing in Raleigh, North Carolina in mid-October had it not been for the groundbreaking and innovative work of this department, DAQ, DWM, DWR, General Counsel's Office, Secretary's Office, everyone, the whole team in dealing with the PFAS contamination along the Cape Fear River. The EPA roadmap mentions the possibility with regard to air emissions. They mention the possibility of using Clean Air Act Section 112 as a framework for regulating PFAS, either individually or as a class. So, that would start, of course, with listing certain PFAS as hazardous air pollutants. And then that would need to be supported by risk assessments showing that there are significant inhalation risks associated with those compounds. So where does that work? And so we know that there's some risk assessment work being done for inhalation at this point, but most of the focus has been on other routes of exposure, such as ingestion. So I think there's still a lot of work to do. We are keeping tabs on that with regard to inhalation risks. What's next in our in-state efforts from the Division of Air Quality standpoint? Well, I think Assistant Secretary Mazemore mentioned earlier that we're having those discussions now, and we in DAQ are learning more every day from colleagues and other state environmental agencies, from EPA and academia and other sources about potential sources of PFAS, about fate, atmospheric transformation, atmospheric transport, stack testing, control systems, you name it. We are a sponge. We're sharing information, but we're gaining information and knowledge along the way. So that's just a continuous process in all of this, and it will be for all of us moving forward. So I would say stay tuned as we continue those discussions internally on those next steps.
Very helpful. And now that you mentioned, the possibility of maybe regulation under 112, I know EPA is right now in the process of really their first addition to the list of hazardous air pollutants regulated under that section with 1-bromopropane. Do you think there's any precedent that might be set out of EPA's current work on their first addition to that list that might also lay down the playing field for what is to come on PFAS, if that might be a similar pathway for that set of chemicals?
It could be. I think that the blueprint is there, but it's just a matter of what's the data and the science tell us with regard to inhalation of these compounds. I think that needs to be a focus, and we don't fully know. We know that for just a few of the PFAS compounds. We don't know that for many of them. So yeah, I think that framework definitely holds the best potential moving forward to regulate at a federal level.
Very interesting. Can you give us any update on the efforts to deal with the specific instance of PFAS emissions? You already mentioned the Chemours facility. Is there anything you can tell us about an update on how the division is handling those issues and moving forward, recognizing that it's breaking ground, looking through these issues in a way that might set a standard for other states to follow?
Sure, and I think really the centerpiece is just focusing on implementation of the consent order that was entered into with the company back in 2019. And the significant air emission components to that, and holding the company accountable to those and following up, and it's a lot of work. And we have very frequent internal meetings to work through implementation of that order, and you'll hear that from the other directors, I'm sure, today as well. But that's really the status, is just reviewing all of those the information that's coming in pursuant to those requirements, and also continuing to collect environmental data nearby the facility to see the environmental response to the reductions in air emissions.
Great. Well, we're about to move to our last topic, at least on the list that we had prepared to discuss, to get folks thinking about key air issues in North Carolina. So if anyone else in the audience has a Q&A to provide for us, we'd be happy to try and answer those. So check that box at the bottom that Emily was pointing to as well before, and let us know if there's anything that we can cover for you. We'd be happy to give you a shot at a free question here for the Director of Division of Air Quality. But moving on to our last topic, one thing that we always want to talk about, it's a necessary part of any good air quality program, and that is enforcement. No one wants to be in enforcement. No one wants to have violations, but they are, in a sense and in some ways, inevitable. And so the division has to have a good program for enforcement and a strategy for finding a way to use that productively, to make sure that the rules that are there to protect all of us, protect our environment, are enforced. So what can you tell us about the division's strategy for enforcement that might be helpful for individual sources to know that might be facing someday the possibility of a violation of these important requirements?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great topic, and always like to touch on this topic because I really don't refer to it as an enforcement philosophy or strategy, but rather a compliance strategy, because compliance is a shared objective, and we're committed to it. The regulated community is committed to it. It's important for corporate scorecards. More and more people are paying attention to compliance cultures. So it's as important as it's ever been. There are a couple tips I think that I would like to briefly share that always help. And these are core to staying in compliance. One, during the compliance process, request a pre-application meeting with DAQ. I think even Shushma touched on this briefly earlier in a different context, but early communication is good. It's free and allows our professionals to work with your professionals to ask questions that may help you. So that's definitely a recommended step. Once you get your permit, please read it. Please be familiar with the requirements. It's painful when I see violations that raise to the level of issuing a civil penalty that are related to not really understanding a requirement or recognizing a requirement that's in the permit. That's 100% preventable. And you know, things like late reports. All right, well, in our tiered enforcement structure, if that's your first offense on a late report, that's simply a notice of deficiency letter and we're moving on. But 4 late reports in 2 years, that's a different issue. Or 6 late reports in 3 years. You know, we've had a couple of those instances, and so those are painful. So please be familiar with your permit. And then third, please take advantage of training opportunities and workshops like the air quality workshops that NCMA organizes, but our staff are the presenters and the staff for those workshops. So that's a great training opportunity. We also have quarterly outside involvement committee meetings hosted by our division on all things across all of our programs that offer the regulated community opportunities to kind of see what we're working on and ask questions. There's also the Carolinas Air Pollution Control Association, or CAPCA, where we commit to have staff there to interact with the regulated community. It's a great opportunity to talk with our folks. And that spring conference is coming up April 6th through the 8th in Asheville, by the way. Shameless plug, so definitely check that out. But in terms of a strategy, for us, it remains regular inspections result in higher compliance rates and lower violation rates. And it's working. Actually, in the last federal fiscal year 21, DAQ had the lowest violation discovery rate in the last 5 years. So since I've been director, it dropped to 3.15%. And that's a statistic that covers over greater than 1,700 full compliance evaluations across the state in that federal fiscal year by DAQ. So that's great news. I'm very pleased that it dropped almost a whole percentage point over the last 3 years, but the lowest point certainly over the last 5, or actually 6 years. So that's good news. So I think the strategy is working. Our numbers compare favorably or are better than many in the Southeast. So anyway, that's our strategy, and I definitely feel strongly about it, and the data bears that out.
Well, that's great news to hear to any source. I think that, of course, there ought to be and is a shared commitment to compliance, finding a way to make sure that these rules do what they're supposed to do, and that you are taking such significant efforts to make sure folks have the tools to hold up their end of the bargain as you're holding up yours. That's a great way to look at it, and I think North Carolina is better for it. So thank you for that. We do have one question in the Q&A. I thought for a minute there that we would have answered everyone's air questions, but finally someone decided to join the conversation. If anyone has more, we've got more time. So please, it's never been easier to ask a question. But the one we have that is dealing with an issue near and dear to my heart, landfills. Most people don't think of air emissions when they think of landfills. They think of what's on the ground. But air emissions from landfills are, of course, very important as well. The question asks, can you provide an update on management of methane emissions from closed or pre-regulatory landfills? Urban infill brownfields development is putting more pressure to redevelop these landfills, and managing the methane and landfill gas emissions is a key component for those development opportunities, but it has to be technically defensible for safer use of these landfills. What can you tell us about current efforts to address that important issue, if you can?
I'm not sure I can in distinguishing between closed and pre-regulatory landfills and currently functioning landfills. So I'm more familiar with those. I'm not as familiar with any initiatives for the types of landfills listed here, but I'll be glad to follow up with Jeffrey on that question after talking to some of our experts. But, you know, managing methane in general is definitely a priority globally and should be, given its potency as a greenhouse gas. You know, the federal regulations that are in place that apply to landfills are somewhat complicated and difficult for even seasoned air quality professionals to tease through and explain. When I mentioned some of those areas we need to build a bench earlier, we lost one of our landfill experts in permitting recently as well on our team. So this is an area where we need to do some work. But yeah, I think with the specific components of that question, I think I'd have to defer today and follow up. But thank you for the question, Jeffrey.
Good question. I guess teeing off of that, I'd be curious as well as to the status of North Carolina's regulation for existing landfills. Are you guys subject to the federal plan, subpart 000, or are you under a state plan for subpart CF? Just not aware right off the bat.
Yeah, we've been trying to untangle that complex federal plan web for some time. So yes, is the answer. We are working through that right now and working to update many of the landfill permits for which those rules apply.
Definitely a confusing set of rules.
Yes.
Any landfills should definitely engage with the division and try and find the best path forward. Well, that's all that we have on our list of topics. It's all that we have in questions from the audience. So I guess we will turn it back over to you, Sean. And Mike, thank you again. This is so important to have this kind of engagement between the regulated community and the regulator. So we really do appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mac. Really enjoyed it. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mac, for the both y'all. That was a great discussion. Our next segment is going to be with Jamie Reagan. She is the Director of the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service at DEQ. She's going to speak to us about the Environmental Stewardship Initiative and the Permitting Transformation Program. So with that, I believe Jamie is on the line and ready to go. So please, Jamie, take it away. And thank you for being here this morning.
My pleasure. Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, perfect. I just want to make sure. I'm bad about talking and nobody listening, but I don't know it's because of a speaker. It's probably for other reasons. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk today about the DEQ programs, Environmental Stewardship Initiative and the Permitting Transformation Program. And I'm excited to be able to jump right in. So we'll go to the next screen. Next slide. So to give a little background before we talk about these programs, I just wanted to give a quick overview of what my division does and how it fits into those two programs. We are exactly what our name is, Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. Some of you may know us. We used to be Pollution Prevention and Environmental Assistance, but we are a non-regulatory division that is here to assist all of you. And what we want to do is provide that pollution prevention assistance, technical assistance, financial assistance where it makes sense and where we're able to, specifically around recycling infrastructure. And all the work that we do, there is no cost associated with it, of course, but working with us is voluntary. So we appreciate this opportunity to get in front of everyone to tell them about ourselves. Because again, being non-regulatory, you may not have the pleasure of working with us unless you come to us. So we love the opportunity to get in front of you. We really want to help entities that want to go beyond compliance and beyond regulation. So we all want to meet our regulatory requirements, but how do we go beyond that? You may have sustainability goals. You may need help navigating through the permitting process or have general questions about permitting, and you may not know which regulator to reach out to. So you can reach out to our division and we can assist with that. We also house the state recycling office. We provide technical assistance. We have different recycling grants. And we really want to be able to focus on reducing your environmental footprint while recognizing economic benefits or even cost avoidances or reductions when there's a possibility to do that. So next slide. So here to focus on Environmental Stewardship Initiative. That is a DEQ recognition program. And it is housed within my division, and we've been running it for over 20 years. So that's a huge testament. It is not a legislatively mandated program, but it has survived and thrived for 20 years. So we're excited to be celebrating that this year. We're funded through an EPA grant. And of course, it is a voluntary program at no cost to y'all. But the department wanted a way to recognize facilities that were going beyond compliance and really emphasize working through having an environmental management system. And many of you are familiar with that. Some go to the ISO standard, the ISO 14001 standard, but we can help you implement one even if you choose not to go to get certified through the ISO 14001. We typically focus on that superior environmental performance, but we may have some members that need additional assistance and technical assistance, and we're here to help and be able to recognize those that do go beyond. It is a secretary's program, and it is overseen by an advisory board, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes as well. And even though she's not presenting, Marsha Alaco is in the conference too, so she's going to help me field any questions. She's overseeing the program. And again, I just wanted to highlight, we are at 20 years, so that's a huge testament to the partnerships that we have with members, some of the members that are here today, and our other members, and working so closely with the regulated community. Next slide. So here's our map. You can see us spread throughout the state. Our members represent every region in North Carolina. In 2002, when we started, we had one steward, and that's our highest level. Today, we have over 200 member sites. And right at the bottom there, you see our partner level. That is our entry level. And you see we have 55 partners that add 158 sites. At our partner level, we allow a facility or an industry to join, but they may have multiple sites. For instance, we have Martin Marietta that joined, and they joined as one, but they may have 18 sites that are under that one application. But once you go up to the rising steward and steward level, it is site specific. So just to give a little information, that partner level is designed for a broad range of organizations interested in developing a strategic approach to improving their environmental performance. Partners must demonstrate their commitment to comply. They have environmental performance goals, and they agree to report annually. The rising steward at the next level meets all those same requirements, but they demonstrate that they have a mature EMS and they have environmental performance goals that are measurable. And again, one thing that everyone does is they do report to us on their goals, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But our stewards, our highest level, that's our elite designation for organizations that have this exemplary environmental performance beyond what's required by the law. They have aggressive environmental performance goals. They commit to meet and go beyond compliance, and they have community outreach and different activities. So they're integrated into their community. The other great thing about our stewards, and we will talk about that some more in a minute, is that they serve as mentors to our other members. So it's an exciting opportunity to get to work with a variety of different industries, and even you as a member or potential member to get to have access to all these facilities is a great opportunity. Next slide. So these are our members, and you can see it's a wide range of folks, and they range from different manufacturing facilities. We have industrial sites, we have pharma, agribusiness, local, state, and federal government, municipalities, military, technology, food and beverage. We just recently started having some breweries join the program. So it's a wide range, and there is no pigeonhole. It's open to a multitude of people, and where it's beneficial is you can learn from each other. And I think that's been one of the great things. A brewery may not understand how they could learn from a manufacturing facility, but we're going to share some examples how there is benefit in that, and it's open to such a wide range, and we encourage each of you to consider joining. Next slide. So what are the benefits? Why would you want to join? So I wanted to run through some of these, and hopefully some of these will resonate with each of you. So when you come into the program, you get a coach. That's one of the DEEC staff people or staff persons who is going to be your point of contact. And oftentimes they'll help you with different things in the ESI program, but you may need a broader point of contact. For example, we had one member that was dealing with a new change in some hazardous waste rules, and they weren't quite sure how that was going to apply to some of their current processes. They had a material that was a result of one process, and they used it in their next process, in another process, but they weren't sure in between process 1 and process 2 if it was considered or classified as a hazardous waste. So they wanted more information. They reached out to our coach. We, of course, reached out to our regulatory sister agency to get the information, and was able to share that back with the facility, help them navigate through that. You can always reach out to your regulator, of course, but sometimes folks like having that have that anonymous touch. And then what's also great is that coach, by learning from you, is able to share that information with other members. So you may call and have a question, and because we've been on site at another facility, we may be able to provide that information to you, or do that legwork and find out what you need to know, whether it's a regulatory question or whether it's a best practice. To be clear, we never share proprietary details, but we do share best practices, and can even share what's worked and what hasn't worked, because that's also a valuable lesson that's important for you when you're stepping into something new. We have on-site assistance. We can provide internal auditing training, of course, that environmental management system development. We had one facility back when the ISO standard changed that wanted a training. So our staff was able to go on site at no cost for about a week and provide the training to that facility, but they also brought in their sister facilities from across the state and even in Canada. So they were able to get that at no cost, and to have that opportunity to have that training and it happen at their facility at no cost. Of course, we have different types of technical assistance. We can focus on waste reduction, energy savings, and all these things generally will yield hopefully in some kind of cost avoidance or cost savings. And then we have the recognition for many of the facilities, having that opportunity to be part of a program with the department, to get to utilize the logo. If you're a steward, there's a ceremony on site at your facility, and the secretary comes to your facility and there and provides the award, and there can be press there. So it's a good opportunity for that recognition as well. Then, of course, the trainings, we have EMS, internal auditor trainings. We have partnered with our regulatory sister and brothers to come on site or either do a virtual training about different regulatory updates. And of course, that steward mentor, what we talked about earlier. But one example of that is we had a facility that had corporate goals to get down to zero waste. And they were having a problematic material. They had foam, and they were trying to figure out how to manage it in a way that it was cost effective, or so that they could not dispose of it, find a home for it that was cost effective and would meet their goals. One of our other facilities had recently purchased a foam densifier and had gone through the experience of learning about it, finding out which was the best one, utilizing it and seeing the benefit from it. So that facility invited the other ESI member on site to see how the foam densifier works, to learn about it, to understand which vendor they used. So having that direct opportunity to go on site and learn from somebody that has done it was hugely beneficial. So that's having that steward mentor available that you can reach out to at any time and ask questions has great benefit. And then, of course, we have our steward forum. That is where all our stewards are invited to sit at the table with the secretary of the department and ask questions, to learn from the secretary directly about what's going on in the department, get her input on any new updates. If a steward has any questions or concerns, they can raise them at that time. They also can share great compliments about the department and working with our regulatory agencies, and that has happened. So it's just that opportunity to have that direct contact with our secretary and with other stewards, just with the stewards at the table. Then we have the different networking events. We have our annual report. That's something we'll share, and I'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. Then different networking events. We have an annual ESI conference. That's a several-day event. That's where our members come in and share some of their stories. They talk about their best practices, talk about their goals. We have regulatory agencies that come in and give different updates. So in addition to, the secretary comes to that event and provides a recognition of all the new members in the program. So it's a wonderful learning opportunity to have folks that are doing the same things that you may be doing or similar things, even though your widgets or your processes are different. We all have these environmental goals that we're trying to reach, communicating with our community, and these best practices that you can learn directly from one another. And then those topic-based conference or topic-based trainings, I'll talk about it in the next slide. But then we have our listserv. It sounds very antiquated, but what we found was extremely useful when a member had a question like that hazardous waste question that I asked earlier. When we find that answer, we can share that with everyone else in case someone else had that same question. Again, we don't share that which facility it was, but that facility themselves could have posted that on the listserv and said, hey, I have a question. Has anybody else dealt with this? We have folks throw out, hey, I had a vendor that was accepting this material. They're no longer taking it. Does anybody else have any recommendations? What software do you use when you're trying to avoid missing when a permit's due and you have the reminder software or tracking software? So to be able to have that direct connection with other facilities has been useful. And of course, a newsletter where we provide quarterly updates, whether it's regulatory updates, member updates, and different training opportunities that are coming up. Next slide. So when I was referring to those topic-based member-led events, this is an example of some of the events that we have had, and we call that our environmental benchmarking series. And that started in 2018 because what we learned is that a lot of times when a facility has a question and they want to know something about, how do we reduce our energy consumption? How do we address compressed air leaks? What do we need to do? Certainly we can go on site and help, and we're happy to do that. But what we also have learned is it's a huge benefit when one facility can hear directly from another facility that says, hey, for instance, what used to be Cahan said, we're going to invite you to our facility. We're going to show you how we have addressed some of our energy issues and how much funding or how much money we have saved. We're going to give you a tour of our facility. Learning directly from somebody that has done it and has a similar situation as you may have, and to learn from what mistakes they made in that process or what they gained from it, who they used, all the different benefits that they have seen has been something I think the members have really appreciated, having that direct connection with others that can share these stories. We typically have these in person, but of course during COVID, we have transitioned to virtual events. But as soon as we're able, we're going to go back on site, because to be able to see the facility and do a tour and see it firsthand is what we see the greatest bang for the buck. Okay, I think there's a little pop-up. Yes, we have an upcoming event in February. So if you're interested in attending, typically our members get first priority, but sometimes we will allow others if the facility is open for it. So if you're interested, let me know. Or you could just join the program and then you have access to all of this. Okay, so this is when I was talking earlier about our annual report. So our members report annually on their environmental goals. Typically there's a focus on energy, waste, and water. And what we do is we compile all that information so that we can put it in our report, and we share it with all of our members and with the public. We will not share your specific information unless there's a particular story you want to share. But you can see the cumulative numbers here, which are extremely impressive, to gather this from 200 different facilities here in North Carolina, 200 sites in North Carolina, to share this information. So we think there's huge value add, and it's a great testament to North Carolina and the things that we're doing. Down there at the bottom, the total cost savings, that's completely voluntary for a facility to send or share with us. And that is something that we think is really important to recognize, because as we all know, doing great practices doesn't have to mean that it always costs money. There could be cost avoidances, there could be cost savings. And those are things that we want to make sure that we share when we're telling the story. And again, that information is not reported by every single member. A member can voluntarily share different stories about their cost savings. So we imagine that the cost savings is much higher if every member did report. So next slide. So these are some of our pretty graphics. When we take these stories, what you report, how do we put that in digestible information for others to see? So of course, here they are, these beautiful graphics that you see, that we're able to save enough water to fill almost 60,000 pools. And then of course, power almost 108,000 homes. These are the savings that our members have reported, and these are what you can see from that. Up at the top, you see the savings by goal types. And of course, energy usage reduction is a huge one. That's where most of the financial savings we're seeing. Okay, next slide. So here is our advisory board. I spoke earlier about our advisory board oversees the program. They oversee, of course, the program development and the implementation. The secretary approves all the invitations to the board, and whenever possible, environmental stewards who have been in good standing in the program for at least a year will be given the opportunity to be on the board. And as you can see from this list, at least 9 of these right now are current ESI stewards. And why that's so important, when you have the people that represent the program also serving on the board and providing input when there's a renewal that comes up, and every 5 years after you become a member, we have a renewal process. And that means we go back on site, we do another compliance check, we see how things are going to make sure that you're still in good standing. And then we, as the DEEC staff, report that to the advisory board. And they look and they see, okay, well, look, this facility, they're still doing great things. We want them to stay in the program, or this facility received an NOV. They did a root cause analysis. We understand why they received it. You know, earlier Mike was talking about missing reporting dates. Well, that may come up, but the facility shows that, well, they missed this date, but they put in this new software to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So what's really important is its current members that may be experiencing some of the same issues can look at what caused an NOV or NOD, or may cause some kind of concern at the plant or the facility, and they can go, wait, we've been there, we've done that, we understand it, or hey, there's no reason that's continued to happen, that's a problem. So that advisory board will say for these renewals, well, we recommend that they stay at the steward level or the rising steward level. Or if it's a new facility coming in, they evaluate that facility's application and the report that our staff pulls together when we go on site to validate the application. And they'll say, yeah, we recommend that they get to join the program. We recommend that maybe they start at a partner level. If somebody applies at a higher level, but the advisory board goes, yeah, I'm not so sure, maybe they should start at this rising steward instead of the steward level. They look at that, but they lived in and breathed it, so they understand it, and they make a recommendation. And then that goes up to our secretary, and our secretary will say, yes, we want to invite them to join, or no, not yet, or whatever the case may be. And then the member will receive a letter from the department saying, this is what we are inviting you to do, or what our results of your application are. And just again, the role of the advisory board is to review the program materials and make suggestions for improvement, review applications that meet minimum requirements, and recommend the rising steward and stewards, review program effectiveness, and make any recommendation for changes to the secretary, and then any other duties that the secretary may say, hey, I need your help with this. So next slide. Oh, and I will say we have 2 open positions there, our small business and our NGO. So we'll soon be looking to fill those and provide those recommendations to the secretary, or she'll tell us who she would like to fill those, and we send out an invitation to join the board. Okay, next slide. So now I know you're all ready. Oh my gosh, I'm so ready to join. What do I need to do? Of course, you can apply online, or you can reach out to me and I'll share that link to you. But just to reiterate, when you want to join, you have to commit that you're going to meet compliance. And I don't think that's an issue with anybody here in this conference today. Not be under any environmental, criminal indictment or conviction. You're going to say, hey, I'm going to report annually. I'm going to share my environmental goals. One thing I want to say is we're not asking you to create any new goals. I imagine every single person here today has some type of environmental goals, probably focused on energy, air, and water, that you already do. We just want you to share that information with us. You don't have to share any proprietary information. Sometimes our members will normalize their data because they are unable to share certain pieces of it. So we accept all that. We just want to be able to have that opportunity to work with you when you truly are someone that cares about what you're doing, how you present yourself to the community. You want to be in partnership with DEQ. And that's one of the great things about this program. Oftentimes, people have this impression that the regulated community is at odds with DEQ, and that's not the case always. And so oftentimes when you have a program like this, and especially one that's been around for 20 years, and you can show that these facilities that we regulate also will stand in partnership with us, raise awareness to us if there's something that we could do better, but stands with us to say, hey, we care about North Carolina, and we want to make North Carolina a great place to be for our employees, for our environment, for our neighbors. So that's one of the great things about this program. And I want to make sure everybody here has the opportunity to understand and hopefully want to join as well. And the schematic there is just shows how the process works. We receive your application. We do have an internal DEQ work group that reviews and does a compliance check and just shares that information. If you have had a compliance issue, it's not an automatic means that you will not be able to join the program. We just assess that and try to understand it, and especially see that it's not a repeated issue. And then, of course, if you are at one of the higher levels, rising store steward, it goes to the advisory board after we go on site and validate your application, and then it goes through the process. And at the end, the secretary makes that final decision. Now, if you choose to join as a partner, we do still do the internal work group review, but we send those directly to the secretary. They do not have to go through the advisory board. And when you join as a partner, you immediately get to take advantage of the benefits of the benchmarking series, us coming on site and helping you, having that coach assigned to you, and access to any of the other members. All right, next slide. So I wanted to share a couple of examples because I know it can be challenging to really understand these conceptual ideas when we're just sitting here talking. So these occurred last year, and it was a challenge last year during COVID as we were transitioning to coming back into the office because we had been teleworking and still providing assistance virtually, providing webinars and things of that nature. But we started to transition back on site once the facilities could allow us to come back on. So these are a couple of examples. The pictures with the reels on the left were a facility that was interested in joining ESI. So our ESI team went out on site and they were looking for a home for these reels. And that was one of their largest waste streams. And as the ESI team was there, they were looking at them and they were evaluating, well, wait a minute, the suppliers of these reels, who's also another ESI member, they have a take back program. So they were able to put them in touch with each other, and the facility was now able to say, hey, this is no longer going to the landfill. We can send it back to who we purchased them from or back to this other ESI member who's a supplier of some of these reels. So that's just that, you know, it seems like that would be simple enough, but sometimes your facilities, you're really into what you're doing. Your staff doesn't have a lot of time sometimes to focus on some of these issues. So when you have this network here that is able to do some of that legwork for you, do some of that investigating to help find these solutions is what I want to emphasize by this example. This other example here is Riverbend Malt House. They're located in Asheville. They joined as a partner in the program last year. Their mission is to create a unique, high-quality malt for the brewing and distilling industry, sourced from local family-owned farms. So we went out on site, ESI staff, along with our waste reduction partners, because they wanted assistance with their sustainability plan and implementation strategies. They were targeting water and energy consumption, waste stream options, and recycling options. So our staff was able to go in, talk with them, learn more about what they were doing, and then help them identify solutions or opportunities to meet these goals that they had. So next slide. So here, wanted to highlight a couple of our members and some stories about them in the program. And Grifols, of course, I believe is also a chamber member. They're located in North Carolina, Clayton, North Carolina, and they manufacture plasma-derived medicines. They joined the ESI as a partner in 2006. They moved to the rising steward level in 2013 and achieved the steward level in 2017. As you can see from the brochures here that they produced for when we came on site to do their steward ceremony, their goals go way beyond just their regulated pollutants. And in 2019, they hosted a regional recycling summit in cooperation with our recycling group, which is inside of our division, that's the State Recycling Office. And last year, they assisted Division of Energy, Mineral, Land Resources with their monthly stormwater webinar series by discussing their industrial stormwater efforts. And Grifols is also a member of our advisory board. So I wanted to share that story and hoping that some of that information may resonate with you and certainly make you go, gosh, I want to join this program. I want to have my information on up here one day. So next slide. So this is one of our other members. There are 3 different Smithfield locations that serve in the ESI program. So we have Smithfield Fresh Meat Corporation, the Tar Heel facility. They joined as a partner in 2002 and became a Rising Steward in 2005. Smithfield Fresh Meats Corporation, the Clinton facility, joined as a partner in 2004. And then Smithfield Packing Meat Corporation, Wilson, joined as in ESI as a partner in 2004, became a Rising Steward in 2005, and a Steward in 2007. So the Smithfield location that I wanted to talk a little bit right here produces around 500,000 pounds of bacon per day. So I will say that was a great site visit when you can go on site, and that day they happened to prepare some bacon, to smell bacon cooking. I imagine if you did that on a daily basis would just be a great experience. They hosted a virtual environmental benchmarking series event this past November that focused on their water reduction efforts. So I wanted to tell a little bit about how the facility, they cut their water use in half over 2 years through adjustments to equipment, modifications to daily procedures, and the implementation of a wastewater reuse program. The facility surpassed the company-wide 10% water reduction goal 2 years ahead of schedule and achieved annual savings of more than $200,000. And that's about a 50% water use reduction from early 2017 to early 2019. So they also were recognized by the Smithfield Food President's Award in 2019 and the National Association of Manufacturers as a recipient of the 2020 Manufacturing Leadership Award in the Sustainability category for their impressive water reduction goals. And they represent the agribusiness sector on the ESI Advisory Board as well. But I'm saying that because when you get the opportunity to learn directly from them, even if you don't do the exact same processes in their facility, in your facility as they do, to be able to have that opportunity to learn from them and see what worked and what didn't for work, there's always bits that you can take and hopefully be able to use at your own facility. So next slide. All right, the next program I wanted to talk about was the DEQ Permitting Transformation Program. So that's the initiative to streamline and modernize permitting with online processes to be more transparent and have more accessible data. And I know that's something that everyone here is interested in. We started working on this, as y'all all know, a few years ago, but we didn't have any funding to do the work. And like I mentioned earlier, there is a big cost involved in doing these kind of systems because it's not just the front end that you see, there's a lot of back end work that has to happen. But this year we did receive funding from our legislators and so our goal is, with that funding of about $5 million per year, is to take that and really be able to now implement these things that we want to do. With the very first most important piece is we as DEQ want to make sure that we are doing our processes, our permitting processes as streamlined as possible, and making sure that we're consistent and that we're documenting everything on our end so that we are able to share that information. And that's our first effort. We got to be as efficient and streamlined as possible. So there's the first phase is, now that we have the funding and we can move forward, we are going to be looking at our processes, cleaning them up, leaning them, making them as efficient. And then we take all that information, we gather the business requirements needed for this new online system that we have partnered with the Department of Information Technologies. DIT is implementing the solution for us. So they're going to take these new streamlined processes and they're going to implement them into this new online system. So in this partnership with DIT, we will see great success and be able to now get this online presence that we need in addition to what the pieces that we already have in existence. But then to implement that across the department for all of our permitting programs. And in addition to having that, of course, that online presence where you can apply for your permit, you can track it, you can pay for it, you can do everything online. And then you have that pizza tracker that we were talking about earlier where you can see where you are in the process. We will have that opportunity to have these dashboards where you can go on and gather information and see what's going on across the state in your region with different areas going in the state to see how things are impacting across the board. So wanted to share, we have been working on this, but we have done it without funding. But the good news is now that we do have the funding, we have been able to go ahead and start with the first program that's going to be going through this streamlined process that we want to do with PTP. And the Brownfields program started a couple of weeks ago with doing their future state mapping, and they're starting to go through the leaning process and gathering their information. And our goal is to have their piece done, and they're the first that we're going through with this new funding. So we will get better as we're going through it. But they're going to be handed over to our development team, which is our DIT agency, to start developing them to go online, and that should happen in the second, third quarter of this year, so that once we get the streamlining done, Brownfields will go into development with DIT, and hope by next year you'll be able to see them as the first ones going online, the first ones with the new funding. With the previous funding that DEQ put forward, we had Division of Coastal Management, their major, their general, and I believe their minor permit. Hopefully we'll be going live first quarter, second quarter of this year. So next slide. Wanted to share this real quick. DEECS provides an annual report where we want to summarize some of our stories. And again, like I mentioned earlier, working with us is voluntary. So we wanted to be able to share what we do, and hopefully these bits of information and these stories will resonate so that it makes sense, or you can see the value add that we could bring, and how we can help you is the most important thing, how we can go and be of service to you or bring benefit to you. So you can access this annual report. It's online, and I'm also happy to share with you. We now are doing it every other year because it is a huge body of work to complete this, but you can access it, and I'm happy to share it with anybody that has an interest. And the next slide is just my information. Please reach out to me if you have questions about anything I've talked about today. If you want me to talk more about any of these topics or anything else that DEECS does, or anything for that matter, because I just like talking, but by all means, you're always welcome to reach out to me. All right, have questions for me?
Jamie, it looks like there are 3 questions in the Q&A box. The first one was, can non-members get on the newsletter for the ESI program?
We do have it where we allow non-members join, yes, for the newsletter. So if you will, just shoot me an email or give me a call and we'll get you set up.
Second question was if there was any update on staffing needs or the emphasis on the Brownfields program. And I think you've covered that one, at least in terms of where the program is for permit transformation purposes. And maybe we'll add that also to our list for Michael Scott for later this afternoon when he comes on. And then last question is the ESI program focused on industrial or manufacturing-based companies, or can office-based companies apply for membership as well?
Yes, the answer is yes. Anybody can reach out. Typically, our members have been regulated or received some type of regulation from the state, but recently we did have one member that was not regulated because they worked themselves out of any permits because of the practices they've had. But I would encourage that office to reach out to us, and we can talk through it with them to see if they would be a good fit.
Okay, great. Well, Jamie, thank you very much for coming on and telling us about ESI and the permitting transformation program. We're now scheduled to take a break until 10:30. Please try to be back a couple minutes before then so that we can resume on time and hopefully finish up on time. Thanks a lot, everybody. We look forward to seeing you back in just a few minutes.
Thank you.
All right, I take that to mean that we are back. And if I may say briefly, with all due respect to Journey, I was really glad that we got a little dancing queen in there again this year. That was fun. I'm now joined by Sharon Martin with NCDEQ. This is our segment on the environmental justice program. I might stop for a brief moment to give Sharon an opportunity to introduce herself to the conference, and then we will launch into the program. Sharon, it looks like you're mute. Oh, there you go. Thanks.
There we go. Good morning. Thank you, Sean. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Public Affairs here at DEQ. And under my sort of report are the public information officers, the environmental justice program, our environmental education team. So I cover a lot of sort of the storytelling and the outreach parts of DEQ. So thank you for having me this morning.
Great. Thank you very much for being here.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we jump right in?
Sure.
At last year's conference, we tried to give everybody sort of a basic understanding of the concepts that are behind Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the broader concept of environmental justice. For those who missed that discussion, would you mind just giving us the basics of how environmental justice fits into the department's larger public engagement process and what the environmental justice aspects of that process are intended to accomplish?
Absolutely. You've already heard a few times this morning about how DEQ is working to modernize our processes. And I think it's fair to say that as a society, the way that we do business excuse me, and the way that we view the world has changed significantly in the last few years. And the pandemic has exposed a lot of the inequities and problems in our system at the same time that it's required us to move schools and meetings online, and meetings exactly like this one. People are not only more aware of what's happening around them and more concerned about what might be impacting their health and their communities, they're also more engaged and more interested in being a part of the conversation. And all of that has increased the focus on whether government processes are equitable and whether government works for all communities and not just some communities. And I think that larger context is important as we talk about DEQ's public participation processes. So thank you for indulging me with that. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that no person in the United States shall, on the grounds of race, color, and national origin, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So as a recipient of federal funding, DEQ is required to comply with Title VI. That also applies to recipients of federal financial assistance that passes through DEQ in the form of grants or subcontracts, as well as federal financial assistance that comes to DEQ from another state agency. Environmental justice builds on that non-discrimination policy of Title VI to ensure the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So essentially, that's everything we do at DEQ. And I think, as you heard last year from Renee, and I won't go into nearly the detail that Renee does, what you should hear as you work with DEQ is that we're committed to transparent and open processes, to giving all communities a seat at the table and an opportunity to be involved in decisions that the agency makes. So we have a public participation policy that lays out some of the actions DEQ might take. Mike Abrasinskis mentioned this, to ensure that we're meeting our obligations, to engage the public in an equitable and meaningful way. And for some communities, whether you call them underserved, disadvantaged, or EJ communities, that may mean additional outreach to give them the tools to participate in our processes. I mean, as you all know, every permit has slightly different rules and regulations, and a single site might involve several separate processes with different divisions within DEQ. And while the regulated community understands and is used to this, if you can imagine encountering these permitting processes for the first time after some signage goes up near your house, that can be a really new and unfamiliar experience for some people. And this is not their day job, not their field of expertise, and suddenly they're trying to learn how to get involved in a very complex process that literally hits close to home. So at DEQ, and especially with my team, we want to deliver on our core mission to provide science-based environmental protection to all North Carolinians. And a big part of that means helping people understand what we do and how we do it. So what does that mean in permitting? It means that for many large facilities or new greenfield facilities entering the permitting process, we'll do a quick screening to see whether an underserved community will be affected by a proposed project. Based on that initial screening, we'll tailor an outreach plan to share information with the community and engage them in the process. That might include a draft EJ report, additional outreach to community groups and local officials, maybe adding a meeting before a hearing to allow for some Q&A. It's not a one-size-fits-all process, and the actions will depend on the needs of the community and the type of permit. And all of this happens during the permitting timeline. The outreach happens during the comment periods involving our public affairs team and the division staff. This is a DEQ effort and a responsibility that we undertake, not the applicant. And we'll talk a little bit more about what applicants can do in just a minute. I'd also like to note that we're doing this additional outreach for grant applications as well, considering which communities may need more support to navigate the grant processes and the best ways to make sure that they're aware and able to participate and apply for the available funding, like the VW settlement or the water infrastructure funding that Secretary Beiser mentioned.
Okay. And have I got this right that there's a listing of programs on the department's website that are sort of presumptively assumed to be subject to this process, and that then in addition to that, each individual division director has some discretion as well based on the level of public interest that they're seeing regarding a particular project. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there is an internal list. I'm not sure if it's posted. I'll have to look into that, Sean.
Okay, great, thanks. Could you, next sort of major question that I had was, could you give us a sense of the types of comments and public input that DEQ is receiving as part of the public engagement process, and how frequently you all are seeing that this process results in things like additional stakeholder meetings or outreach beyond what's required under the permitting regulations? And then sort of as a related point, how has that gone over the course of the last two years as we've been in the midst of the pandemic and so much of what we've been doing has gone virtual?
Sure, I'll start with the second part of that. I think the pandemic has sort of it's had mixed results for us. In one case, in one side, it's taken a lot of our in-person engagement away and our ability to be kind of on the ground in communities. We've also really encountered the digital divide. It's difficult if you don't have broadband access to attend an online meeting. You may not be on a listserv. It gets a little bit more difficult to engage directly with communities. On the other side of that, moving a lot of these meetings online means that, for example, rules hearings that used to have 5 or 6 people attend might have 50 to 100 people. So I think we've seen that in some ways it's more accessible that you don't have to travel, but if you don't have those the capacity and the broadband ability, it makes it more difficult to attend. So it's been important to us to find ways to make sure those meetings are accessible by phone, that we provided other options for providing comments and outreach. And so we've really been focused on making sure that we're not excluding folks because of where they live or what their income levels are and what their internet capacity is. So that's, it's something that we're going to have to keep thinking about. And then I certainly hope moving forward that we can take the best parts of that, that has made it more available for people to attend things across the state moving forward into hybrid meetings. But those are all certainly things we'll have to encounter as we move forward in the next year or so. Back to the first part of your question, for the most part, we are typically talking about permits that have some sort of requirement for a public process already. Title V permits, for example. In some cases, the divisions may also opt to hold a public process when it's in public interest, if that's appropriate and allowed in their rules. In some cases, that process might involve adding a press release and outreach to community groups or tribal officials to the standard comment period. Other times, it may be scheduling a public hearing at the start of the comment period instead of waiting until the end of the comment period, especially if we anticipate getting a lot of requests for a public hearing. That way, we don't have to add that additional 30 days of notice for the hearing itself. Again, we'll tailor the outreach to the community and the project to make sure that residents are aware of that opportunity and have the information they need to engage in our process. Our goal is always going to be to incorporate the public engagement into the permitting timelines. You may have noticed that in many cases, our permitting teams are now including alternate dates for hearings in case of weather to avoid additional 30-day notice periods for rescheduled dates when that's possible. The permitting and public affairs teams may also do additional meetings with community groups to help answer questions about the permitting processes prior to a hearing. Again, we want everyone to understand the process so that they can meaningfully participate. And you asked a little bit about the types of comments. Depending on the type of facility, the range of comments can be really broad. It might be opposition or support for an industry in general, concerns about exposure to chemicals, about dust, about noise, about traffic, really all of the issues that you would worry about if someone were building a new industrial plant in your neighborhood. In some cases, we also get very specific technical questions and comments. And so the permitting staff will review all of those comments, separating them into those that are relevant to the permit and those that are not. Concerns or questions raised during the public process might merit further review, and that might lead to a request for additional information from the applicant or a clarification of permit conditions or additional testing or monitoring conditions to address a concern. All of that is part of our due diligence as the regulatory agency. Our goal is always a solid permit and one that allows you to do business within the applicable laws and regulations and also protects the public health and our natural resources, since that is our role here.
And I think that's one of the things that maybe I struggle with, both as someone who's representing an applicant, but also as someone who's trying to anticipate how the department is going to respond to what sounds like a very wide range of comments that one might see, right? Everything from something that's very specific about, compliance with the NACs as part of an air permit application versus a much broader concern about an industry or effects on a community. And I'm sure that there's a natural inclination in some folks to say, well, if I've got something that really isn't germane to the specific permitting issue that is the subject of public comment, maybe you want to say, well, that's not really what we're here to talk about. But to me, especially with the understanding that, you've got folks who are becoming engaged who may not really understand the details of some of these programs, that feels awfully short-sighted because nobody really enjoys being asked for their opinion and then being ignored. I mean, do you agree with that? I mean, what should folks anticipate and be thinking about when those types of comments are coming in, and how would you suggest they respond to it and work with the department to respond to it?
Sure, I can talk about how the department responds, and then also how the applicant should look at those things. I agree, it can be frustrating to feel like you haven't been heard. And so we go to a lot of effort to make sure when we engage the public and hear their concerns, and as much as possible, we want to respond and explain the rationale for the department decisions, usually in a hearing officer's report or response to comments document, for example. We've also been very clear that this is not a popularity contest. We're not counting votes on whether a permit should or should not be issued. It's not a matter of how many people are opposed versus how many people support. Again, our focus is on issuing a good permit that follows the science and follows the law. And sometimes that means we have to say the issues raised are outside the scope of this particular permit or even outside of DEQ's authority. But I'd like to make the point, Sean, that when residents are raising a concern that's outside the scope of DEQ's permitting authority, it's not necessarily outside the area of concern as an applicant. You're a future member of that community. So if everyone in the community is raising this concern, it might be something that DEQ can't handle, but as the applicant, maybe it is something that you should think about. I'm speaking from a public relations perspective. I think it's worth thinking about whether that's a concern that you can address if it's something that's being voiced publicly. You as the permitted business will be in the community for a long time. We're going to write a permit. We're going to move on to the next permit. We'll be back for inspections. We'll make sure you're in compliance. We'll come out when there are complaints, but your neighbors are going to be there with you every day. So I would boil it down a little like this, that most communities are asking businesses to be a good neighbor. The communities that you go into, regardless of income or demographics, ultimately, they want you to be a good neighbor, to be a valued part of the community, to provide a benefit, jobs, tax income, and to treat the community as you would your own. You can absolutely be a cynic. You can come into a community, do the bare minimum, fight every attempt to hear or address community concerns, and establish an adversarial posture with the local community. We've seen that. That is an option. But we've also seen how that plays out with contested permits and litigation at every step of the way. And I would argue that may not be the best way to spend your time and money. There's no specific statute that I'm aware of that requires you to engage proactively with your neighbors. That is up to you. But I would argue it's bad public relations not to do it. My recommendation is always that as a business, that you listen to the concerns, that you consider the comments, that you consider what you're willing to do as a good neighbor. And you may find that an investment on the front end could alleviate headaches and pay dividends in the long run.
Okay. And as I think about something even that Mike Abrazinskis was saying earlier, right, that you don't want the community's first knowledge of your project to be the public notice about a draft permit. And the idea, of course, being earlier engagement. Have you seen any particular practices or approaches that have been successful in facilitating earlier engagement and things that have helped to get a conversation going and for it to be constructive?
Absolutely. As a communications professional, I shouldn't say that this isn't rocket science. It is not hard. It is literally about reaching out and providing information to folks, and Mike's right. When we've seen examples where people have reached out and connected with their community, it sort of smooths the process. You're not going to eliminate all opposition. You're not going to eliminate all concern, but certainly you can lower the temperature of the process as it comes to us. We find that people do tend to be the most upset when that DEQ hearing notice is the first time that they've heard any information about a project. They feel blindsided. They don't know who to trust. It starts the entire permitting process off on the wrong foot. So being in your community and making your intentions clear really kind of paves the way for this process, because times have changed. The general public is a lot more activated. They are more interested in what's happening in the communities than in years past, and they expect more from government and from businesses. I mean, if you spend 5 minutes on an app like Nextdoor or Facebook, you can find dozens of posts about the new whatever that's being built over on Main Street. And people share a lot of information. They want more information. They want you to share more information with them. So when we talk about best practices, absolutely early engagement is at the top of the list. You're not just building a facility, you are joining a community. And I know that's kind of a touchy-feely way to think about it, but connecting with the neighbors closest to your site early on, not just the local officials, but your actual neighbors, letting them know what's going on, answer their questions, provide them with a person they can call when there's a problem. All of those actions build a relationship with your community, and you can develop a level of trust, and that leads to a much smoother process by the time DEQ is involved. And, you know, transparency goes hand in hand with that. Go ahead, Sean.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, to build on that, actually, you know, I think sometimes folks may find the concept of environmental justice and this engagement, it's a little disconcerting because it may be a little bit outside the traditional norms of the way that things have been done. And one of the things that I try to do with a client, and I'm sure that anyone, you know, all, you know, the other lawyers, the other consultants who are, you know, outside professionals try to do, is to help manage a client's expectations about how things are going to go, which one of the things that might help is for a client to understand sort of, well, what role would the client or an applicant or a member of the community expect the department to be playing in these situations? Does the department view itself as a, you know, sort of the third party neutral? It's not really the one who's going to be making decisions about things that are beyond presumably the scope of the permit. Are they more the communication facilitator? How is there a way to describe sort of how an applicant and how the community, what role should they expect the department to be playing in these situations?
Well, our role is, you know, we're the regulator. We're also the public steward. So we're neither advocating for nor against a permit. Because of the nature of our work, we have contact with both the facility and the community. And so we're sort of in the middle just from the nature of that. But our goal is to make sure that the community has all the information it needs, and that DEQ has all the information that we need to make sure that we're issuing the best permit that we can. And so, you know, I think applicants should look at the public process as an opportunity. All of the information that's coming to DEQ is available for you as well. So when there's a public hearing, if you're listening to those comments, they're coming into DEQ. We're going to weigh them and we're going to run them through our process. But they're also there for you to hear so that you can understand what the concerns are from the community, whether there are things that you need to address as far as information and contact and what you can share with the community, and the sorts of things that you need to address and be aware of as a future member of that community.
Why don't we shift gears a little bit and let me ask, are there any particular regulatory programs or department activities where you're seeing the most or significantly increased public involvement regarding environmental justice issues? And sort of a related question is, how is the governor's new executive order, it's 246, I believe, how is that affecting the dynamic in terms of the department's public participation plan and specifically the environmental justice components of that plan?
So I would say that this is not limited to any one area, and it goes across the department and frankly across state government, because an air permit is often the first required permit in interaction with DEQ. That division, as Mike pointed out, is often on the leading edge of community engagements. All of the federal and state programs that we've seen continue to see a greater focus on equity and disadvantaged communities. Every message from EPA, every directive on the federal funding that's coming down, it all highlights the need to address EJ and equity concerns and to make sure that we're being equitable in distribution of those funds. Earlier this month, you mentioned Governor Cooper signed EO 246, and it requires every cabinet agency to designate an EJ and equity lead and develop a public participation plan. It also sets up a stakeholder process to consider community input on additional measures to address environmental justice and equity concerns in the future. And as Secretary Beiser said, this is work DEQ is already doing, but it's now expanding to other state agencies. The EO also calls on state agencies to consider environmental justice and equity and allow for public engagement in agency decision decision-making on issues of importance to underserved communities. And it encourages agencies outside the cabinet, local governments, and private businesses to incorporate environmental justice and equity consideration into their work. I think this is an issue that's just, it's going to be in everything. It's in everything that we do. You know, as I mentioned, we're certainly looking very closely at equity in all of the federal funding that's coming down. So this is not something that is limited to any single area.
And I'll ask you to look into your crystal ball then for a second as well, and just to say, do you see any particular program areas or environmental issues where environmental justice is likely in your, just from your perspective, to play a greater role in the future? And where I'm going with that is, if you read EPA's PFAS roadmap document, for example, I mean, they set out PFAS explicitly as an environmental justice concern. And I think that's a pretty strong indicator that it's going to be a driver for the way that EPA is thinking about it. And I know that it's going to affect every program, but I do wonder, are there any where you see a particular emphasis or a particular opportunity for this to become a larger part of the discussion?
Well, I think you saw just this week the announcement from EPA that they're really focusing on compliance as well. So I think it's just going to continue to be a consideration in all major issues and actions for all of the reasons we've been talking about. There's a real focus on funding decisions being equitable. And again, a lot of that goes to outreach, making sure that underserved communities are aware of and able to participate in the application rounds, able to participate in our permitting process. In our permitting processes. So I would expect that communities will continue to be active and engaged and more active and more engaged going forward. I don't know that there's going to be a specific focus. I think it's really going to become part of it should become endemic to our thinking and part of our operations and built into everything. And I think that's part of the reason it's so important that as regulated industry and as permit applicants, that you think about engagement with your communities and how you're interacting with communities and, looking at whether there are ways to address concerns outside of the permitting process. I think you and I have talked a little bit about that. The idea that, if they're raising concerns that are outside of permitting, but there are concerns about your business, are there arrangements you can make with community groups? Are there agreements that you can make? EPA often recommends things like community benefit agreements, where you might make commitments to the community to offset the impact that you're bringing in with your new facility. So I think this is something that it's not just something regulators are thinking about, it's something that everyone should be thinking about.
Before we open it up to questions, I wanted to give you an opportunity to, are there any particular final points or overarching messages that you'd like attendees to take away from this conference? And since I've got the mic for a second here, I'll throw mine out there, which is, have I got one of the things that I sense is that there's a little bit, I think, of just, like I said, discomfort maybe with the process and opening a permitting process up to a much broader layer of public participation, because it's more difficult to predict what the outcome is. But to me, that almost feels like a paradigmatic shift that has already happened, and that train's left the station in large part. I don't know if you can respond to that, or if you see it the same way that I do, but that is kind of how it feels. And with that, I'll give it back to you. Are there other messages that you wanted to drive home to folks or reiterate to folks?
I think there has been a real shift. I think that, all of the move even to make records accessible online, that's a fundamental shift from the way we were doing business 5 and 10 years ago. Your applications aren't always coming in now on giant reams of paper. They're available online. The public wants access to those things and is entitled to access to a lot of those things. So certainly, I think thinking about this as just a natural part of the process now, again, what communities are asking for is for you to be a good neighbor. The rules and regulations are the rules and regulations, and our permits will be based on the applicable state rules and regulations, but we are going to have to open up the process to make sure that we're meaningfully involving all of the citizens who want to be involved, all the residents who want to be involved in the process. That's important to us, to our responsibilities, and to the responsibilities we have as a public steward and a public agency. So I think that's, thinking about being a good neighbor, thinking about that in more of that aspect, I think might help with a little bit of that discomfort. But I don't think this is something that's going to revert to the way things used to be.
Fair enough. I think that's it in terms of the questions that I had. It doesn't appear that we have any Q&A from the audience, but before we end the session and shift to our next group, which will be Danny Smith and Stanford Baird, are there any folks in the audience who had any questions? All right, seeing none, I guess that's it. Thank you so much, Sharon, for being willing to do this and coming to talk to us today. I think we all know this is going to be an ongoing conversation for some time to come. So look forward to talking to you about it again soon.
Thank you. And of course, always feel free to reach out if you all have questions about it. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. And with that, I think our next panel will be regarding the Division of Water Resources. Stanford Baird is going to be our moderator, and he will be talking with the Division Director for DWR, Danny Smith. So with that, I will turn it over to Stanford and Danny. Go ahead, guys.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that. I'm not sure Danny's going to appreciate his picture there next to me in that intro, but in any event, hi, welcome to the State of Water 30-minute section of the conference today. I'm Stanford Baird. I'm a partner with the Canagates law firm here in Raleigh, and have been practicing environmental law for 25 years in North Carolina. And I'm the star of this 30-minute segment is Danny Smith, the division director for the Division of Water Resources at DEQ. Danny has decades of experience at DEQ, going back 28 years, I believe, Danny, if I have that right. Going back when the agency was known as DENR, and even back to when DENR used to have an H in it, right? H stood for health, and folks that know that have been in the game for quite a while. So Danny has served as the division director for DWR for the last 2 years, and before that had an interim stint, I believe, Danny, right, as the director at Demler, and he served as the Raleigh Regional Office supervisor of maybe at that point it was Division of Water Quality for a number of years. But in any event, Danny, great to have you, and thanks for your time today speaking with the chamber audience. So similar to the discussion that we had last year, sadly this is our second year doing this virtually. We're going to talk about some of the sort of division topics, accomplishments, initiatives, et cetera, and then talk about a few selected higher profile topics as well. So Danny, sort of jumping right in here, could you talk a little bit about, so you've now been the division director for 2 years. Could you talk a little bit about the accomplishments of the division that you're proud of over the past, I guess since we did this last time, past 12 months?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'm glad to be here today. As far as the accomplishments for 2021, it's been a great year. Again, everybody's still enjoying the challenges with COVID, but we still had a lot of great successes. Our planning section, I've been working on basin-wide plans. Those basin-wide plans is a process that identifies areas in the state by watershed or basin-wide approaches for protection and restoration and preservation of waters. They've been working specifically with the Chowan and Pasquotank and White Oak River basins. They've had those basin plans approved by the EMC this past year. Our groundwater resources section and select regional offices have been, actually all the regional offices have been working with CAMA, the Coal Ash Management Act. This is efforts to review site assessments and corrective action plans to make certain that the coal ash basin closure efforts are meeting performance expectations. So that work's been ongoing. And the groundwater resources section, along with the Morrisville office in Fayetteville and Wilmington, has been working on some high-profile sites with Chemours and the Colonial Pipeline spill responses as well. Our water sciences section's been doing a lot of work with ambient monitoring and REMS and emerging compound issues. And again, we have 7 regional offices across the state, from Asheville, Morrisville, Winston, Raleigh, Fayetteville, Washington, and Wilmington. So in those regional offices, we have public water supply staff that work with Safe Drinking Water Act rules governing these water supply systems. We also have staff that work on wastewater treatment plant issues. They conduct inspections and review non-discharge inspections and monthly discharge monitoring reports to ensure monitoring and sampling has been done correctly, buffers and stream calls. And there's a lot of interaction with the public as well with respect to complaints and questions about permitting and our interactions about just the resources in general. So all that's been done with and all the field work that's coincident to it and adhering to COVID-19 safety measures. So it's been a busy year, and very proud of everybody's accomplishments.
That's great. Thank you for highlighting all those things. You mentioned the regional offices across North Carolina. Could you talk just a second, Danny, about how do you assure consistency in interpretation of regulations and application of regulations and guidance documents in particular across the regions and within your
Go ahead. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
Within DWR.
Okay. Well, that's a great question. We have, again, I mentioned 7 regional offices. We have routine consistency meetings and with the supervisors and staff meetings. And to your point, and the subject is excellent because consistency is one of the things that we hear about the most, and I mean it well, is that we have staff turnover, we have new rules come into play, and then you have regional offices that are separated. So we work real hard to try and ensure consistency is maintained. And it's one of those, and I tell this to staff regularly, that it's not a checkbox kind of issue. You go do it and it's done. It's one of those things that you have to keep working at because we have staff turnover and we have new issues and new compliance issues that come up, or changes that occur over time. So it's one of those things that that it is a staple kind of a work item that you keep reinforcing with staff and with the regulated community as well. But it is something we continue to work at and is a priority.
Okay, thanks. Could you talk a little bit about compliance initiatives or areas for compliance that the division is sort of focusing on or highlighting? And I think you might have some slides you wanted to share with the group, and maybe you could lead us into the slides and would ask the chamber staff to pull those up.
Okay, great.
So go ahead, Danny. These are slides that you provided that I think you wanted to speak a little bit about compliance and reporting issues that were of specific interest to the division this year.
Very good. I will apologize. See if I can find the share screen.
I think the chamber may control the slides. Dan, you could just ask them to be advanced. Yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. Misunderstood. So yes, there's some select compliance and reporting items I was wanting to go through. So let's see if we can do this. Did I do the next slide, or does
just say next slide and the chamber will magically advance forward?
That's awesome. Thank you. All right, so the Division of Water Resources, we implement we're delegated to implement a portion of the Section 402 of the Clean Water Act, where we issue discharge permits for wastewater treatment plants. This slide really depicts that. We require modeling and ensure that the pollutants that are discharged from the plant is appropriate for the receiving stream, and that the residuals get properly land applied. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is that there is a host of permit conditions and requirements that are common to permits, and I want to go through these. And I think some of these will be helpful for not only this permit, but maybe apply in other settings as well. So one of the first things we always say is to make certain you read and understand your permit. And then these MPDS permits, they have a limits and monitoring page. They often will have winter and summer limits that are different. And the frequency can be of sampling is daily, weekly, monitoring, quarterly, or annual, depending on the parameter and then the complexity of the permit. They can be composite samples or graph samples, so the sampling type varies and is specific to that permit as well. It's important that the sample that's collected is that you use a proper EPA method and that you report in the proper units. And one of the things that we encounter sometimes in the field is that the permittee secures a permit or secures their renewal of the permit, but they may not make the text available to their operator or to their staff. So it's important that information gets pushed down the line so that their staff are working with the most current version of the permit. There can be maintenance schedules or structural integrity studies or other things, or the limits could change or frequency changes. If they don't do that, that can be missed. So in these permits, there's common reporting requirements and operation and maintenance expectations. So we'll talk about a few of those. So next slide, please. So this slide depicts some significant structural integrity issues at a wastewater plant. It's certainly an operation and maintenance issues. The point here simply is these are permit conditions and you're required to address them. And often in many of the different types of permits we have are O&M expectations. So next slide, please. Bypass is another item. It's a diversion of waste stream from any portion of a treatment facility. So bypasses are prohibited unless to prevent loss of life, personal injury, severe property damage, and there's no feasible opportunity, and you must also properly report it. So, but it can't be for equipment downtime. The reporting requirements are 24 hours and 5-day written report follow-up. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a bypass. So part of my point here is having your staff and having folks that work with the facilities operations understand what is expected and what may constitute a problem. And this particular issue is a bypass. It wouldn't be authorized, and it's actually resulting in an illegal point source discharge. Next slide, please. So non-compliance notification requirements. So if you have discharges of significant amounts of waste that are abnormal in character or quality, or any process unit failure known or for unknown reasons, or pump station failure or treatment facility problem that results in a bypass, you're supposed to provide this non-compliance notification. Again, that's the 24-hour report requirement and 5-day written report. Next slide, please. And this is on the right is a package plant. It had some sort of problem where it lost solids in the receiving stream. The sludge judge on the left fixed the solids that you can see. So they've had an upset condition or bypass that would need to have been reported. And so the facility, the owner, the folks would need to understand these permit conditions and their reporting expectations. So that's woven into the permit. This is something I encourage staff that have these permits to kind of appreciate and understand the expectations. They can also reach out to the region for questions on those issues as well. Next slide, please. So I'm shifting from wastewater treatment plants to collection systems. This is a high priority sewer line, meaning it's an aerial line. It requires a higher frequency of monitoring in the permit. Next slide. The permit contains conditions that include, again, to be properly managed, maintained, and operated. There's operation and maintenance requirements, record keeping, monitoring, and reporting requirements, and inspections. With that, there's a host of record keeping that's required. And so when we would do an inspection, we would be able to review those records and understand how the permittee is actually overseeing that infrastructure through that permit. Next slide. So if we were to encounter a aerial line failure or structure failure, we would be going back through those records and looking for the, again, the notification to us and expecting that the permit conditions were being followed through. Next slide. So as a part of the collection system permits, they also have items in there about sanitary sewer overflows. There's a requirement for SSOs to report any spill that reaches surface water or any spill that's 1,000 gallons or greater. Again, this is a 24-hour, 5-day reports. There's also requirements for news releases to occur if somebody has 1,000 gallons or more of untreated waste to surface waters. Again, this is within 24 hours. This used to be 48 hours, but it's now a 24-hour report requirement. And then there's also a public notice requirement for discharges of untreated waste for 15,000 gallons or more. So next slide, please. So this is an SSO that it's got that will require they'll have to unclog the SSO, remove the solids. Also, they typically would put lime out to help raise the pH to deal with help with disinfection. There may be waste going downstream and solids in the stream. They will need to do some work to try and recover as much product as they can. Again, there's still the requirements of the reporting. Next slide. So I want to talk about this for an instant. This is a manhole that's overflowing. One of the this overflow like this can be caused by blockage, but it also can be caused by what's called I&I, inflow and infiltration. Infiltration is when groundwater is reaching or seeping into the collection system, adding to the hydraulic load. Inflow is where water is coursing into the collection system. It could be from a stormwater connection that's inappropriate, or a deflection in the pipe that's gotten water that is coursing or flowing into the collection system. Either way, these things cause significant problems to the wastewater treatment plant. They cause SSOs. They are difficult for the with respect to managing solids and cause a lot of cost, and it can cause problems for the plant to manage their hydraulic capacity, have capacity for expansion or new sewer extension permits. So that's one of the second major problem wastewater treatment plants have is managing residuals. So solids is another issue. Having the capacity, properly operating wastewater plant is going to generate solids. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of construction around here, which means we got a lot of complaints on construction. Next slide, please. One of the things I'd encourage, if you're a lot of facilities are maybe expanding their size or needing a new laydown area, that sort of thing, I encourage you to get the consultants that know about wastewater, know about streams and wetlands and riparian buffers and land disturbances that trigger the need for erosion control. Next slide. Again, the erosion control issue can prevent downstream impacts, causing water quality standard violations. Erosion control is DMLR, and they for Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources, but also those control measures are paramount to protect downstream and waters and surface waters. Next slide. And this is really a placeholder for me. I wanted to encourage everybody, if you have or work with bulk storage of chemicals, I just wanted to take a second, encourage you to spend time with making certain your secondary containment is well managed and that your chemical feed lines are well managed. That little bit of preventive maintenance on your part can keep major significant spills from happening. You know, obviously, this is not quite that setting, but certainly has a spill associated with it. So you would certainly encourage you to learn about how to properly report for EPA and then their state requirements for oil spills as well. Next slide, please. And this says the regional office locations, and I've also included the contact numbers for the region in the next slide. And that's all I had. I know I went through that real fast, but I wanted to touch on a few things really quickly.
Great, thanks, Danny. Really appreciate you sharing with our group kind of compliance tips, permit compliance issues, areas that the division really looks at closely. How would you say overall the state is doing from a NPDES permit compliance standpoint? I know that EPA, when they released their most recent national compliance initiatives with regard to water quality compliance initiatives, one of them was trying to reduce significant non-compliance with NPDES permits. And I think EPA reported that they had reduced that number by their estimate from about 20% of all permits down to about 12.5%. Where does North Carolina stand as relates to significant non-compliance or general non-compliance?
Okay. So for significant non-compliance issues is related to having effluent limits exceedances in your permit and having them at a frequency that results in the facility being determined to be in significant non-compliance. There are some facilities that kind of teeter back and forth between this, that they are in compliance and then they have trouble and they get back out of compliance. So one of the things that we do in the region, between the region and the central office, the inspections and looking at their discharge monitoring parts to try and target those facilities. And I mean as well from a targeting standpoint, from looking to see who's got trouble and who's got compliance issues, and work with them and try and work with them to get them, if they need to be, work with them to get them into an SOC, a special order by consent. Oftentimes, if they're having some compliance issues, it's generally that they're in need of some sort of upgrade of the facility, and there's going to need to be some kind of schedule and timeline to get them back on track and in compliance. So it's one of those things that the regional offices and the central offices work on. So I would, I'd like to say, overall we're in good shape, but it's one of those things on the infrastructure that's pretty unforgiving that you have to continue to look at and keep working on.
Okay, thanks. Well, why don't we go ahead and just shift a little bit to some of the individual topics that we had talked about in our preparation for this discussion. So it wouldn't be really a discussion of water topics in North Carolina or nationally without some discussion of waters of the United States and jurisdiction under the Federal Clean Water Act. Affectionately, this term is WOTUS, right? Waters of the United States, and it's really important because it defines the line when an activity becomes regulated under the Clean Water Act, and then through all of DWR's implementing regulations, it determines when a permit is required, which then, that determination when and whether a permit is required then can lead to all these other obligations that flow from that, such as mitigation, time, cost, the potential for third-party litigation, likelihood of delay in a project, et cetera. So it's a real major issue for participants in in agriculture, forestry, real estate development, for infrastructure projects, transportation projects, renewable energy projects, pipeline projects. I could go on and on. So it's really a very important issue. And it's one of those the definition of WOTUS and its interpretation is one that has, in the past several federal administrations has been in flux as one party or another has taken the reins at EPA. They have changed the interpretation of what WOTUS means and how it should be applied. There's a long and tortured history in the federal courts on the interpretation of the term, and then that in turn trickles down to the state implementation. And so the history goes back much further, but just starting back in 2015, EPA, the history on this, EPA and the Corps of Engineers adopted the 2015 WOTUS rule during the Obama administration, which generally broadly expanded Clean Water Act jurisdiction. And then in 2019, that rule was repealed. And in 2020, during the Trump administration, the 2020 WOTUS rule was established that adopted some bright lines of what is and what is not water of the United States subject to jurisdiction. And then, both of these rules were controversial. There was litigation of both rules, depending on the litigant's perspective, et cetera. And of course, when the 2020 rule was being was going through the rulemaking process, North Carolina DEQ, objected to the draft rule, and then the state joined other states in litigation to overturn the 2020 rule. And then when the Biden administration took office last year, within several days of that, they began efforts to dismantle and repeal the 2020 rule and replace it with a rule that would ostensibly go back to the pre-2015. And then as all that rulemaking was taking place during 2021, sort of updating from our discussion last year, while that was going on, there was litigation to oppose the 2020 rule. And then in August of this past year, a federal court in Arizona vacated the 2020 rule, set it aside entirely, and the Corps and EPA stopped implementing the 2020 rule nationwide. Further, then in December of just last month, EPA published the proposed replacement rule for the 2020 rule, and indicating that this would be a placeholder, then they might go back and start from scratch with a whole new definition of WOTUS, et cetera. And then on Monday of this week, just a few days ago, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear another WOTUS case, the Sackett case, which was heard initially back in 2012. They're going to hear it again and revisit essentially the Rapanos case from 2006 and the significant nexus test, et cetera, to evaluate the proper legal test to apply. So just wanted to provide a little bit of history on this. So as all of this was taking place at the federal level, then Danny, at the state level, DWR and EMC moved forward with a North Carolina wetlands rule to address some, permitting or jurisdiction gaps that were perceived to be in place. Could you update us on that, how that came to pass, and what the current status is of the North Carolina rule?
Yes, absolutely. So in June 2020, changes occurred to the Clean Water Act federal jurisdiction for wetlands. So this resulted in certain wetlands and landscape positions to have a permitting gap, like you mentioned. And it applied to this federally non-jurisdictional wetlands as defined by the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So to be clear, those wetlands are still wetlands. They had connections to downstream waters, and they certainly still have the functions that wetlands have. Obviously, they have water storage functions and flood prevention, and important for storm resiliency, and from a water quality standpoint, pollutant removal, like nutrients and phosphorus and turbidity, sediment, metals, and certainly habitat suitability, importance for fisheries and SABs and that sort of thing. So the wetland functions and the wetlands are important, but the issue is that we no longer had, they were no longer jurisdictional, subject to the 404 Clean Water Act, and they remained protected in North Carolina. And we did not have a permitting mechanism to authorize impacts to the jurisdiction that was removed by the Navigable Protection Rule. So what we did is, again, in 2020, we had to understand what the 2020 rule meant and how the Corps was implementing. And as we did that, we had to put together, or chose to put together, a temporary rule as quickly as possible to help address the permitting gap. So the EMC adopted that temporary rule in May 2021. And this was to provide a permitting mechanism to the regulated community. So the adopted temporary rules was for expedited relief. That temporary rules was the fastest way to produce a temporary rulemaking method to allow for permitting. So once the temporary rules were adopted, we immediately began the rulemaking process. And so this past fall, September, EMC approved permanent rules for public notice and public hearing. And as you mentioned, in August, the month before, the EPA announced revisiting the borders of the U.S. definition. Obviously, for a temporary rule, they're only good for 270 days. We had to go through and immediately go through the process of permanent rulemaking and getting a remedy on the new federal rule definition in 270 days is not likely. And again, as you mentioned, the vacature of the 2020 rule also occurred, reverting back to the pre-2015 regulatory regime. So we got so we went forward with the rule, one, to provide certainty. During the fall, we were receiving guidance from the Corps through October through January on how they intended to interpret the vacature. But what at the end of the day, what was important and what was the issue for us going forward was that there was approximately 300 wetland determinations determined to be federally non-jurisdictional while the 2020 navigable waters rules was in effect. And for those sites that if we don't go forward with these or didn't go forward with the permanent rulemaking, there would have been a gap in the authority for us to authorize permits for those wetlands. So without adoption of those proposed permanent rules, there wouldn't be a permitting mechanism. So in January, the EMC approved the rules and they are at the RRC right now. So that's where we are right now.
Okay. So, and my recollection is, this is kind of old history now, that the division faced a similar situation after the Supreme Court decision in the Swank case on isolated wetlands, and then the state adopted an isolated wetlands rule, which when it was first adopted was, in my view, sort of elastic. That is, it covered everything that was a water that was not federally regulated, and so there would never be a permitting gap, right? That it would grow. The isolated wetlands rule would cover those waters kind of back and forth as the definition of WOTUS contracted or expanded depending on who was in charge of EPA. Now, can you explain why that was not the case here? Why there was a permitting gap rather than?
Oh, yes. So the Swank decision resulted in isolated wetland rules. The Corps of Engineers was determining what was jurisdictional under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and the isolated wetlands were not subject to the 404 jurisdiction. So we have state isolated wetland rules, and what the Corps would do is they would do a delineation to determine where the wetlands are, what was subject to Section 404, and what was isolated. With the 2020 navigable waters rule, they no longer were making a decision on isolated wetlands. They weren't doing that anymore. Rather, they were saying this is subject to 404 and this is not jurisdictional. So there was a bucket of wetlands that still had a nexus, still was connected, or not isolated, and there was no permit to address that bucket of wetlands, if you will. It was federally non-jurisdictional. They certainly were not isolated, and there was no permitting mechanism that targeted that group of wetlands. That's the issue.
Okay. Thanks for your explanation on that. We are getting low on time, but before they start the playoff music here at the chamber, let's shift to PFAS real quick. Could you bring us up to date on the regulatory status in the Division of Water Resources as it relates to PFAS?
Yes, sure. That's a complicated thing to ask, I guess, is the short answer. PFAS are emerging compounds, and one of the hallmark of emerging compounds is that they are typically have no or limited regulatory oversight or instruments, and it's really due to lack of information or data and limited toxicological information. So for PFAS, and right now for PFOA, PFOS, Gen X, and other PFAS compounds, we do not have surface water standards. We do have for PFOA and PFOS, a drinking health advisory this is an EPA drinking health advisory of 70 nanograms per liter. DHHS established a health goal of 140 nanograms per liter for Gen X. And EPA is proposing a new health advisory for Gen X this spring. This is for the roadmap. So with respect to standards, that's where we are to date on PFAS.
Okay, now didn't refresh my recollection here. Didn't EMC propose 2L standards for PFOA and PFOS at 70 parts per trillion, and then was that retracted, taken off the board, reanalyzed?
Yeah, so we're going forward with for IMAX we have IMAX and going forward with 2L standards for a host of compounds. There was a proposal for PFOA and PFOS for the groundwater standard for a combination at 70 nanograms per liter. We got a lot of comments on that issue, and the comments in the public hearing process was that they were too high. So right now we haven't chosen to go forward with that 70 nanograms per liter.
Okay, that's what's for further evaluation and determination, I guess. Is that right?
So yeah, so that there's no change. Is that it still would be the PQL for PFAS and the existing 2,000 nanograms for PFOA. That there's an existing IMAC for that.
Well, Danny, we are over our allotted time. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, and I know that we want to keep the trains running on time here. So thank you very much, Danny, for your comments and clarifications on some of these issues. Appreciate it very much. Hope you'll come back again next year. And otherwise, Sean, we'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Stanford. Thank you, Danny, for both of y'all being willing to do this. And this takes us now to the last portion of our program for today, which will be the discussion with Michael Scott, the Director of the Division of Waste Management. Again, Emily Sherlock from Robinson Bradshaw is going to moderate that conversation, and I will turn it over to Michael and Emily.
Thank you, Sean. You get to hear my croaky voice yet again today, folks. So I'm pleased to be here with Michael Scott today. He's been the Director of the Division of Waste Management now since 2016, and has been with the department for 19 years, so has a lot of great experience in a variety of different areas. And he and I have had the privilege of doing this particular segment together for the last, 3 or so years, I think. And for an area that I do a lot of work in, it's definitely a highlight for me. So Michael, we've got a lot to cover. They did confirm that we're running a little bit late, but I think we can hit all of our topics. But wanted to jump right in with just if you can give us sort of an update. We covered last year how the pandemic environment was affecting your division, and from everything from inspections to where are you guys when when the regulated community is reaching out to find you. So can we do just a brief catch up on, okay, here we are a year later and we've been in this environment for a while. What's changed? What's going on with the Division of Waste Management?
Yeah, thank you, Emily, and appreciate the opportunity to join everyone this morning. I would say we're staying fluid. We're ebbing and flowing like others across North Carolina. We found a lot of efficiencies during the pandemic through our remote work, our electronic filing, our inspections, our field work, have continued in a safe manner. We've faced a lot of changes, during the pandemic, some different challenges by not being in the office all the time. But we've had key staff that have been here, processing essential paperwork and permits. We've also seen some significant staff changes, during the pandemic, Emily. We had our deputy director, Ellen Lorscheider, who's worked a lot with us on the rural front, coal ash front. She retired last year. We were pleased for Julie Woosley to transition into our deputy director role here during the pandemic. And we also saw a long-term valued colleague leave, Charlotte Jesnick, in our inactive hazardous sites program. And Charlotte had been with us for several decades, just knew Superfund law and regs inside and out. So it's been a challenging time, but a time that we've also found, great efficiencies. And, we're just, as always, a phone call or an email away if you need something. We have continued with the recent uptick in some of the virus cases. We have been working a little more remotely than we were a few weeks back. And trying to transition back to the office, but we stay fluid. And like I said, have used this challenge with the virus to find new efficiencies and new ways to keep our work moving forward.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't think we expected that we'd be virtual again this year after having done it last
Agreed.
year. But as you can hear in my voice, it's probably a good thing that we're not sitting on stage together today. So let's jump into one of our larger topics, which is there's a number of new pieces of legislation that affect waste management. We wanted to tick through some of those and give an update to our audience. The first of those being one that I know I have touched, and the attorneys in the room and the consultants in the room will definitely be interested in hearing. So there's a new title and then new requirements for recording notices at contaminated sites. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like and practically how this affects us?
Yeah, for sure. To start with, I'd ask, everyone that's interested in this new notice requirement, please take a look at the session law. It would be 2021-158. And it is a new title and requirements, as you noted, Emily, for the recordation of notices at contaminated sites. We were very supportive of moving this language forward and with the conversation with the General Assembly. But within General Statute 130A-310A, the notice of inactive hazardous substance or waste disposal site that a lot of you may be familiar with is now replaced with a notice of environmental contamination. And we really felt it would be helpful for these sites not to have quite such a negative connotation as notice of an active hazardous substance or disposal site, and replace that with notice of environmental contamination. And where risk-based remediation has been completed, there will now be a notice of restricted use. This new terminology is straightforward of the actual intent of the instrument, more acceptable, we believe, to property owners, and also reflects that sites have been cleaned up to an appropriate site-specific standard. And as you dive into that session law, once again, 2021-158, similar options will also be allowed under the other statutes like 215-85A and 279.10. So not only our Superfund inactive hazardous sites program, but also some impacts to our oil pollution prevention program, UST, on this change in terminology. And we are asking by the session law that an owner now has 90 days to respond to a requirement to prepare a notice. I think that previous requirement was 180 days, Emily. We've tried to narrow that up to really keep this work moving. And we feel like the notices now have better information about the nature of the contamination and not such a negative connotation with that notice of inactive hazardous substance or disposal site. So once again, take a look at Session Law 2021-158.
Thanks, Michael. And one follow-up question on that one that I know sort of floated around when this first came out and the attorney saw it. It's like, okay, so we've got these different titles. So practically speaking, we can kind of expect a series of due notifications a lot of times. Would that be the case typically where once you're done with your cleanup, you get that notice of restricted use to flag kind of we're done and have two separate filings?
Right, and that's the intent here, is to have a description that more accurately addresses the status of the site. We feel like the older terminology left it a little open-ended, meaning the current status. And so we really advocated for this change and feel like, it's a positive step, for the industry and for us at DEQ regarding these sites.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the next on our list and we've got a pretty good list of legislation that you're going to cover, amendments to the septic management program. Can you tell us a little bit about that bill?
Yeah, I think the quick note here, it was Senate Bill 474, but we're seeing a lot in the waste management world trends towards longer duration permits. So I don't know that a lot of the chamber members or consultants deal with septic management, septic waste hauling around the state. But the point here being, we're seeing a transition like our landfill permits, Emily, which are now life of site. This was the typical 5-year DEQ permit, has now been transitioned to a 10-year type permit for these facilities. So that was one of the substantive changes in that particular Senate Bill 474. So like I said, I don't know that it has broad applicability necessarily to the chamber audience, but we are seeing waste management permits transition to longer duration, and just wanted to point that out for the members and attendees this morning.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the next one on our list is something that Sushma and I talked about earlier this morning, so the Regulatory Reform Act of 2021 is where that requirement for DEQ to study express permitting came in. And we talked a little bit about how that's going. Can you just speak briefly about that process, specifically to the Division of Waste Management?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Emily. Yeah, the Reg Reform Act should be House Bill 366, but it did require a review of express permitting expansion. We had one program, our soil remediation sites, that some of the consultants that manage contaminated soil or impacted soil from petroleum may be familiar with. It did ask for us as DEQ, specifically waste management in this instance, to look closely at those land farms or sites that receive contaminated soil regarding express permitting. We are having broader fee discussions in DEQ also. Meaning areas that we have fees, the status of those fees, how long have those fees been a certain monetary amount. So it's a good exercise for us as required by this legislation, not only to see areas that express permitting can be expanded or new areas that express permitting may be able to encompass, but also looking at some of our current structures when it comes to fees and express permitting. So we'll be submitting that report, as you and Sushma talked about, Emily, on express permitting and that small subset of waste management facilities that was specifically identified regarding the soil remediation sites.
Can you tell us a little bit about, next on our list is Senate Bill 60, which revises solid waste rules for a couple of particular types of landfills. And this is another one that may not have the broad applicability here, but it's certainly a helpful update we'd like to hear.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for touching on that. Senate Bill 60 did require a revision of some solid waste rules for construction and demolition landfills and municipal solid waste landfills. We had gone through the rule readoption process, which a lot of members may be familiar with. A lot of the administrative code, or just about all of it, had to go through a rule readoption process as required by the General Assembly. These particular rules had letters of objection that were filed regarding their status, but we were able to really reach a good consensus, I believe, with industry on some revisions to these rules. It does help to clarify and simplify application requirements related to landfill closure permits, and some specific changes in what's required with ownership or changes in corporate structure for these landfills and what information is required by DEQ. So it was a specific bill, Senate Bill 60, that touched on those changes for landfill operators. But like I said, an item we feel like we reached a good consensus on with the landfill industry.
Okay, and our last bill on our list for today, the Appropriations Act, I know has some waste management items in it. If you can touch on those quickly.
Yeah, the Appropriations Act or Senate Bill 105, this includes that fee study that I briefly touched on and you and Sushma spoke about earlier today, Emily. We also, we're very fortunate to receive some additional funding for our Bernard Allen drinking water program in the Division of Waste Management. We're also given the ability to address sites that may have contamination in a drinking water supply from PFAS, those emerging compounds that have already been talked about today. And so those were a couple of the key changes or key requirements, looking at fees, the addition of some more funds for our drinking water program, Bernard Allen. And it also, on a different note, on the PFAS front, continued the dialogue on firefighting foam in North Carolina. This has been something, if you're familiar with the UNC Collaboratory, the PFAS network that's part of the UNC Collaboratory, meaning the university researchers, they've really furthered this discussion on firefighting foam, the potential for these emerging compounds, PFAS, to be in that material, and what environmental assessment or at least acknowledgement may be needed when this firefighting foam is deployed across our state. And so that was another key piece, was the registry, as that continued discussion on AFFF, or what we just referred to as firefighting foam, continues across North Carolina.
PFAS always makes the list, and I know we're going to touch on it again here in a few minutes.
That's right.
Okay, let's move next into the waste management program updates. As I think this audience is aware, the Division of Waste Management covers a bunch of different programs that a lot of us touch on a regular basis. And, I think my favorite part of this conference is when we kind of go through and say, okay, what's new, what's going on? And you just kind of provide the latest and greatest that's coming out of each of your programs. So if we can tick through those, let's kick it off with brownfields. What's new and interesting, and would you want the regulated community to hear about the brownfields program?
Yeah, I think the regulated community and probably the environmental attorneys like yourself, Emily, already know brownfields is busy. We exceeded 100 applications into the program for 2021, a new record. So we're running triple-digit applications. We are trying to address that through hiring of some new positions. We've got 3 program analyst positions we're working to fill right now. We're interviewing people, trying to move that paperwork through as fast as possible to fill those positions. We've had a couple of significant retirements and departures. We had a great project manager who left for the private sector. We've had another long-term colleague, Tony Dookie, who retired. And so we've added some new positions, and then we also have some vacancies to backfill too. So we're trying to move as swiftly as possible. They've got a great management team between Bruce, Sharon Eckert, Tracy Wall. We've got Sarah Hardison, who's managing our property management unit, kind of overseeing recorded brownfield properties now as a new manager. And, they're doing great work. We're just trying to ebb and flow with the increased workload and some recent departures from the program that we now have vacancies. At the same time, we're trying to fill some newly created positions, which we're very thankful for. So I've been chiming in on different emails and decision points. So brownfields is something I work on about every week, just so you know, and the regulated community knows. And so I'm trying to support them in this big, push of work that's before them. And that workload, that pace just has not slowed during the pandemic. It has sped up. So it's been pretty amazing. Certain sectors we've seen have slowed up or had problems. Brownfields is not one of them. The pace has increased.
This is definitely a topic that you and I have hit every year. If we're trying to hire some more people, we're really busy, and it seems that each year it's a little busier.
Yeah, we're getting there though. And like I said, with those vacancies, we're going to have offers out pretty soon, the next couple of weeks, making offers to bring people aboard. So that's the good news for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's a good sign for North Carolina too, that things are so busy. It means development's going well.
That's right.
Can you talk to us in the brownfields context too? And I know this came up earlier. I think there's already a question popped up about it. The methane guidance that has come out that's new in the brownfields program.
Yeah, there's a couple of key pieces of guidance. I would say methane guidance and townhome guidance. I find them pretty easily just by Googling them. I don't even have to go to our department, web link. You can just Google NC Brownfields methane guidance. You should find it, and the townhome guidance. But the methane guidance really puts forth the requirements. I think the question was asked earlier about pre-regulatory landfills or previous landfills and brownfields development. We are trying to shy away, Emily, from residential development regarding these sites. Staff talk about, we've seen a lot of the easy sites or low-hanging fruit in brownfields maybe is gone. We're dealing with more and more difficult sites, either methane or vapor intrusion issues, which obviously we can touch on this morning. But that methane guidance puts forth some really critical criteria regarding the type of site. Is it an old landfill that's solid waste permitted? Is it a pre-regulatory landfill that never had a permit? Or is it just a waste site that's not in either of those two categories that unfortunately is generating methane? And what are some suitable proposed reuses? What are the levels of methane we're triggering on? And just some excellent criteria to reference. So like I said, I think that document will really help with the question that was asked earlier. The short answer is, if it's a pre-regulatory landfill, and I think this was the question from this morning, we're really not looking to couple that with residential type development. Not saying the site can't be reused, but there'd be other uses that we think would be more applicable there. So take a look at that guidance. Townhomes would be the other one. We're seeing more and more interest in townhomes. Does present challenges when you think about brownfields and the requirement for land use restrictions. And if you've got a series of townhomes and they're all owned individually, how do you manage those requirements, those restrictions? And that guidance really speaks to that. I think provides some great information for consultants, environmental attorneys to be aware of, even before maybe our program is engaged on that subject. And we know townhomes are popular.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that it's difficult to keep individual owners from monkeying with systems out there.
That's right. And so I think what I would share with the audience this morning is there's an emphasis on the HOA. So we're not saying no to townhomes, right? That's not the position, but there's some requirements. There's some needs for other information and I would say requirements if we're going to go down the townhome path. So that's a great document to reference if that's really what your proposed redevelopment is looking at. Understanding, like we both touched on, Emily, some of the struggles with individually owned property and land use restrictions.
Yeah, that all makes sense. One of the other things that you noted in the preparation for this segment is, soil and groundwater are no longer the main assessment drivers. So what should we be looking at?
Yeah, I would say the world of VI is front and center, right? Vapor intrusion. We brought on some staff with very specific VI experience. We also have that experience in Superfund, like our dry cleaning program. The short message, as you touched on it, Emily, is if it's a groundwater contamination issue, we can say, don't drink the groundwater, right? Straight and forward, we've always done that. If it's a soil issue, we can limit that contact, cover the impacted soil, work around that exposure risk. VI is what's driving a lot of the decision points at these sites, meaning vapor intrusion, and having good assessment data, making sure, if an active remedy is needed, that it's maintained, monitored, followed up on. Those are critical pieces, and TCE is the big one. I think we've talked before about VI and the compound TCE. We worked a lot with the Secretary of Science Advisory Board on action levels in North Carolina for TCE. And just the main point this morning, that's just the main driver now. We're not dismissing groundwater contamination or soil contamination, but a lot of these sites, we're seeing a lot of work related to vapor intrusion.
Yeah, understood. So let's hop to a different program. What's going on in solid waste?
I would say solid waste is one of the programs we've probably seen some of the biggest challenges related to the pandemic. You know, we've seen a lot of waste disruption around the state, Emily, logistical disruption, meaning waste can't move or waste is accumulating at transfer stations related to the pandemic. Drivers are not available, drivers are sick. And so we've been working through a lot of different regulatory issues on the logistics of waste movement across North Carolina. That program's also been extremely busy on the continued coal ash cleanup across North Carolina, transitioning to industrial landfills from unlined coal ash impoundments. So that's our main group that works on the coal ash front with Danny Smith and his team. And they've also been transitioning some of our landfills to EQUIS, our new environmental database that I believe we've touched on before with the chamber. But I feel like we have had success in starting to get that environmental data in electronically into that new application we call EQUIS. And so those are some of the main initiatives in solid waste. But like I said, they're probably the program, has waste also, we'll touch on this, but you know, have seen disruptions related to the pandemic and some of the waste movement across the state.
All right, so let's jump to Superfund. I'm trying to be conscious of our time, and I do have permission that we can run over a little bit.
Okay.
That's okay with our
Okay.
business. But hopping to Superfund, I know that there's some new and improved guidance and tools for site cleanup and redevelopment decision making. Can you touch on a couple of those?
Yeah, I would just, encourage, members and those listening this morning, Emily, to take a look at our screening tables as always. The risk calculator that's used a lot in our Superfund program has had specific improvements made to it to help make good decisions early on in the cleanup process. Remediators also now have the option of entering site-specific information into the risk calculator once again at the early stage of a project, which gives us the potential to screen out, unnecessary action at some of these sites across the state. And so we will still have our PSRG, preliminary soil remediation guide tables are still available for use. And we also now have a combined inactive hazardous sites and registered environmental consultant guidance to help simplify the cleanup process. So just wanted to make sure we reemphasize those available tools for the audience. If you can't find them easily, as always, just feel free to email me or reach out to me, but some great tools are available out there to help with some of our Superfund sites across the state.
We mentioned, we've already touched on the TCE, indoor air inhalation action levels just a minute ago in the brownfields context. And I think maybe it just bears noting that this touches Superfund Division 2. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say about it in this context before we move to the next one.
Yeah, I would just reemphasize, the importance of TCE when it comes to vapor intrusion across our state. We are looking at that 2.1 microgram per cubic meter at the residential level, or 8.8 in a commercial sector. We've had them for a couple of years now, our own VOCARB units to help immediately address if we have indoor air levels that are problematic or above these action levels. And these were levels that we did, as I mentioned before, coordinate with the Secretary of Science Advisory Board. We asked them to weigh in on these action levels, our DEQ guidance related to TCE and vapor intrusion, but put an emphasis on this point this morning because, like you said, Emily, it touches on several waste management programs. And I think, vapor intrusion will be an active front that we'll continue to work on for quite some time. So it was worth putting some emphasis on it this morning. The other item, when it comes to Superfund, we have had a little reorganization in that our pre-regulatory landfill program, has now moved into our special remediation branch. Most of you know that branch as the dry cleaning branch. It works on other things besides dry cleaning sites, but we have made that slight shift. And so really appreciate Delonda Alexander for years of experience, who is now not only helping with the dry cleaning program, other parts of special remediation, but also assisting with the pre-regulatory landfill program.
The UST section. What are the updates for them this year?
Yeah, they're our largest section. There's almost 95 staff in UST, and, they're in a busy permitting cycle with the gas stations across North Carolina. So we permit all of those, if you didn't know, as the Division of Waste Management. We've also, been working on a very large site in Huntersville, the Colonial Pipeline site. This was a site that had a release back in August of 2020. We've now seen over 1.3 million gallons of fuel recovered from that site. It's probably the largest on land release it is in North Carolina, potentially in this part of the country. And so a lot of continued work on that particular pipeline release and next steps. Luckily, we've not had major environmental impacts, meaning surface water or private well water users, but we do have significant amounts of free product and groundwater impacts at that site. So Colonial has kept the UST program busy in Huntersville, North Carolina.
I bet it has. Okay, last but not least on the program updates, hazardous waste.
Yeah, on the RCRA front, we're pleased to announce, when I mentioned Julie Woosley became our new deputy director, that vacated the section chief position. Adam Ulishny is now the hazardous waste section chief. Adam's very talented hydrogeologist that's then been a supervisor in solid waste for several years and has now taken the reins as hazardous waste section chief. And that program's been very busy. They continue to do a vast amount of our PFAS and emerging compound work in the Division of Waste Management. Julie Woosley, as I've mentioned before, Emily, she's helping with that emerging compound work as our deputy director. They faced some different curveballs also related to the pandemic. Like I mentioned, solid waste, we've seen hazardous waste incinerator backlogs and transportation delays. And so we have been working, with the regulated community where these delays and backlogs have popped up. We have been issuing 30-day extensions to address some of these backlogs. And so this is something else that, seems to be derived from the pandemic and disruptions in this waste moving. We don't have incinerators in North Carolina for haz waste, so it's moving out of state, but it still has generated backups for our regulated community. And we've been working to issue those extensions, staying in close contact with other states, and also working with EPA on that front. So if members or attendees today, have a concern or issue with some of these backlogs and transportation delays as it relates to hazardous waste, please just reach out. We're only a phone call away. Our head of compliance, Brent Birch, has really been navigating this statewide. Would be glad to have a conversation, anybody that's running into this situation.
Yeah, I thought this was a very interesting one when we were preparing. If you're a 90-day accumulator and you're going to go longer than that because you can't get someone to haul your waste.
Yep.
The directive is pick up the phone and let DEQ know what's going on, and they will work with you and provide extensions. And as you mentioned to me, sometimes lots of extensions as needed to help us stay in compliance.
Yes.
Pandemic has touched all sorts of things. Okay, I know we're running short on time, so we're gonna kind of fly through the rest of them. The program updates were definitely the meat, so I'm glad we had time to cover those. But if you wouldn't mind, Michael, just, we talk about it in every segment. I talked about it with Shushma this morning. The emerging compounds update, any specifics for waste management that you want us to know about?
Yeah, I would say, our focus, really every program's working on emerging compounds. Even Brownfields has had inquiries and even, financing institutions asking about emerging compounds at Brownfield sites. So all 5 programs in our division, are working on this front. What I'd want to share is some of our active fronts now are looking at our RCRA facility list. We've already looked at those that have had fire training facilities at their site. That's an area we definitely want to talk about, potentially assess groundwater for. We are looking at other manufacturers, platers, the key categories that are identified at the state and federal level where PFAS may have been used or introduced to the environment. So we're working down those lists, working with those property owners, their consultants to have these conversations. My message would be we're really in a collaborative posture, Emily, as much as we can be, until we see the need that there's not coordination, collaboration to look for emerging compounds, then maybe we have to take a different stance. But those are some of our areas of focus. We're active with the rest of the department, as Danny just touched on with the Environmental Management Commission and where we're headed on standards development. We're also watching very closely, as Sushma touched on, changes coming this spring, later this year in the fall at the federal level, whether it's Gen X, PFOA, PFOS, what happens to those toxicity assessments and where do some of these numbers go, meaning potentially downward, and what does that mean in North Carolina from a regulatory perspective? So those are some of our main areas of focus. I'll leave you on this note with PFAS. We are seeing a lot of work on the soil side, meaning soil that's been impacted by PFAS, either from firefighting foam or being moved from military installations where PFAS was introduced into soil. Where can it go? How does it need to be managed? How does it need to be sampled? Is a very, very active discussion.
So when we were preparing for this, I know you mentioned you wanted to say a couple words about the rulemaking within waste management, and we likened it to construction on the interstate. You just get it done and you start again. Do you want to mention a few things about where we are on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of attendees may have been part of the different stakeholder processes for the rule readoption process. And colleagues reminded me the other day that we're finishing up, I think, the last rule set, which is UST, and we restart rule readoption in 2025. So to your point of building the highway and starting again, hopefully it won't be quite as heavy of a lift. Some of our rules were very old and need to be revisited. And we had a lot of great stakeholder engagement and did get them updated. But yes, the rule readoption process is not a decade away. It's just a few years away from starting again. So something worth mentioning for sure.
And then just a very brief touch to EQUIS, which you've already mentioned, which is the online database where folks can find things for different programs. Do you want to give a brief overview? Where do I find it? What's there? How can I use it?
Yeah, EQUIS, we're probably reaching out to you as how EQUIS is working, meaning if you're a specific consultant or permit holder, primarily in solid waste right now on the landfill side, Emily, but we're starting this in the RCRA world also. We would like to start receiving environmental data electronically. And I think that's been a major theme today, moving away from paper files, paper permit applications, now paper assessment data into an electronic format. So this is a new frontier for us. We're transitioning to it as the Division of Waste Management. And like I said, we're starting in a couple of select programs like solid waste, now moving to RCRA, where we'll be engaging the regulated community and their consultants, on receiving what we call EDDs directly from the lab so that data can go into EQUIS versus paper type format. So just another important initiative that we hope helps everyone on the efficiency side and helps us all go electronic.
All right, can we hit a quick, 30-second blurb for Division of Waste Management, specific part of the American Rescue Plan, which we certainly talked about this morning with the Secretary and Assistant Secretary?
Yeah, we've had those conversations as recently as this week when it comes to the ARPA funds, American Rescue Plan. We're envisioned as really a supporting division, but as we know, these infrastructure funds roll out, projects get underway. As I've mentioned, soil already today. We imagine we're going to be roped in on different material management decision points. And so we're considered right now as a supporting agency, but we are expecting even our brownfields program could see incurred work from this funding rolling out. And obviously our disposal programs between solid waste and haz waste, we expect, we'll be working to help, with the successful implementation of these funds, but also make key waste management decisions.
So I know that the community and stakeholder engagement and sort of the transparency and the communication piece has always been important initiatives for DEQ and particularly for your division. Can you just speak very briefly about what you guys are doing to sort of facilitate that, particularly in a pandemic environment, to connect with the community and the stakeholders?
Yeah, we've, had a long history with solid waste statutes on environmental justice and the requirements for landfill permitting. And so we continue to look for new and creative ways to engage stakeholders, whether it's postcards, visiting communities, driving through the communities to make sure we're capturing all the applicable information, and it's not just solid waste. We're working in Greensboro right now on a major pre-regulatory landfill where there's a lot of community engagement input on that remedial design that we're working on right now. And so we're making sure that we seek ways besides just a standard public comment process to gather this information and make sure the community's heard. I think another example is the Davidson asbestos site, which just made it through a completed brownfields process here recently. Years of EPA and DEQ work to take that site with asbestos containing material all the way through a Superfund removal and ultimately a brownfields agreement, and a lot of community input, a lot of community concern that had to be navigated and make sure that we were engaged with the community at the local level, public comment level, and making sure that the final remedy or brownfield agreement addressed that. So all of our programs are touching on this. And like I said, we're looking for new ways to gather this information. And oftentimes it's us being in the community, whether we're on somebody's front doorsteps or at the library at a particular night for a community meeting, making sure we get this input and share information, with the community.
Thank you. I know we're well into the penalty period. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. If there's anything, speak now, folks out there. But as we're waiting to see if anything pops up there, just Michael, I'd ask, do you have any sort of concluding thoughts and, to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I would just say we're a phone call, an email away. Please let me know if I can help with anything, and any input on our programs is always appreciated. One thing we didn't touch on today, we're doing a good bit of solar work right now. There was a piece of legislation I forgot to mention, but House Bill 951 has us looking at financial assurance for solar facilities across North Carolina. And so a lot more to come on that front, and a report that's due in March. So a diverse scope of work. But the concluding comments would be, as always, we're a phone call away, and we'd love to have a conversation before a problem pops up, or any information we can provide to help you with your work or permitting process or working with brownfields, just let us know.
Thank you, Michael. As always, it's a pleasure to do this segment. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Emily.
All right. Well, that will conclude the program. Again, thank you, Michael and Emily. And thank you to all of our sponsors and to our panelists and everyone in the department for your support for the conference today. We do rely on the attendee feedback to provide better programming each year, and would ask that you please complete the brief online survey via the link in the chat box. There'll also be a link in the recap email that you'll be receiving in the next couple of days. Also a reminder, the Chamber is holding its 80th annual meeting in person and virtually on March the 22nd. Visit ncchamber.com for more details about the annual meeting and other upcoming events. Thank you one last time for being with us today. Be well and be safe, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing everybody in person again for this event next year. Bye.